Preface. Two men. 2 centuries apart. 2 worlds that never touched in history, and yet seem to have been born to meet. Marcus Aurelius was born in 121 AD in Spain, into a family of Roman senators. He studied philosophy from childhood, became emperor at 40, and governed the largest empire the Western world had ever known for nearly 2 decades. He kept a private diary, notes to himself, reminders of how to live well in a world that stubbornly made that difficult. That diary, which we now call the Meditations, has become one of the most widely read books in human history. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, in Judea, the son of a carpenter. He attended no great schools. He governed no territory. He wrote not a single line. Yet he taught for 3 years, died in his early 30s, and his words still move billions of people 2,000 years later. What do these 2 men have in common? More than it seems. Both lived what they preached, and that alone separates them from most. Marcus Aurelius was emperor of Rome, a position that corrupts nearly everyone who holds it. Yet his private notes reveal a man who struggled daily against arrogance, impatience, and pride. Not because he was weak, but because he took seriously what he taught. Jesus preached love of enemies and forgave those who crucified him. Not as performance, but as the natural consequence of who he was. Both were misunderstood. Marcus Aurelius was called a philosopher by posterity, but his contemporaries knew him as general and statesman. The Stoicism he practiced was considered by many to be an elite, cold, inaccessible philosophy. Jesus was called rabbi by his disciples, but the religious leaders of his time saw him as a threat, a blasphemer, an agitator. The depth of both was reduced by those who observed them up close, and only time revealed the reach of what they were saying. Both left marks that time could not erase. The Meditations were written in a military camp on the Danube between 170 and 180 AD, and reached us through a single manuscript that survived the fall of Rome, the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, and centuries of war. The Gospels were written decades after Jesus' death, in Greek, in a remote corner of the Mediterranean, and today exist in more than 1,500 languages. Both endured with a resilience that most books and teachings never approach. This book is not an academic comparison. I do not intend to argue that Stoicism and Christianity are the same thing, they are not. There are real tensions between them, and this book will not hide them. But there is a deep conversation to be had between these 2 worlds, a conversation that history never permitted to happen in earnest. That is what I propose here, a philosophical fiction. Marcus Aurelius and Jesus meet in a timeless square, not in heaven, not in hell, not in any specific cosmology, but in a neutral space where 2 men who spent their entire lives thinking about how to live can finally sit, converse, and perhaps learn from each other. The dialogues you will read are invented. But the ideas the 2 represent are real and documented. Every argument I place in the mouth of Marcus Aurelius has its roots in the Meditations, in Epictetus, whom Marcus read avidly, or in other Stoic texts. Every response I place on Jesus' lips has its roots in the Gospels, the Pauline letters, or the Christian tradition. I invented the form, the setting, the dialogue, the exchange. But I did not invent the content. I only put it in conversation. How to read this book. Each chapter addresses a theme: discipline, suffering, death, control, anger, power, the logos, the present moment, virtue, solitude, legacy, peace. In each one, Marcus and Jesus approach the theme from different angles, sometimes disagreeing, sometimes arriving at the same place by opposite roads, sometimes discovering that language separated them more than thought did. At the end of each chapter there is a reflection section with a concrete practice. Because neither Marcus Aurelius nor Jesus were theorists, both despised philosophy that did not change life. Read slowly. Underline what resonates. Disagree when you need to disagree. And at the end, ask yourself not what you believe about these 2 men, but what you will do with what you learned. That, in the end, was the only test that mattered to both of them. Paulo Soler. Introduction, The Meeting. I have come that they may have life, and have it to the full. John 10 verse 10. Begin again each morning. What happened yesterday does not matter. The only question that matters is, what will I do now? Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. The square was not in Rome. It was not in Jerusalem. It existed in the space between all things, the place no map records and no traveler finds by accident. A fountain at the center. Ancient stones arranged around it, as if waiting. A fig tree in the corner, with shade enough for two. Jesus arrived first. He was sitting on one of the stones, bare feet resting on the earthen ground, eyes half closed. He was not sleeping, he never seemed to sleep in any complete sense, even when he slept. There was about him a kind of presence that never switched off, an attentiveness that continued even when the face was at rest. His hands lay open on his knees, like someone with nothing to hide and nothing to fear. Marcus Aurelius arrived second. He came still carrying the weight on his shoulders, not the weight of the imperial toga, which had been left behind, but the invisible weight a man carries when he has spent decades responsible for millions of lives. It was a weight that did not come off with the clothing. He surveyed the square with the eyes of someone assessing terrain before making camp, the fountain, the stones, the shade of the fig tree, the man sitting there. He stopped. Jesus opened his eyes. For a moment the two looked at each other without speaking. Marcus Aurelius had the habit of assessing people before judging them, a habit he had cultivated against his instincts, because his instincts were quick and not always fair. Jesus had the habit of seeing people before assessing them, not what they did, but what they were carrying. It was Marcus who spoke first. "You are the carpenter," he said. It was not a question, but genuine curiosity lived in the voice. "I was the son of a carpenter," Jesus replied. "But I don't believe I built much in wood after the age of 12. Marcus approached the fountain and looked at the water. His reflection there appeared more rested than he could remember being in a very long time. "I have read what they wrote about you," he said. "Not everything. Enough to become curious." "And what stayed?" asked Jesus. Marcus considered. It was a question he took seriously, the question of what remains after the reading passes. "The idea of loving one's enemies," he said at last. Epictetus spoke of caring for all human beings as members of the same body. But love of enemies is different. It is more difficult. Almost impossible, in truth. "Almost," agreed Jesus, with something that was nearly a smile. Marcus sat on the stone across from him. He was not the kind of man who stood when he could sit. The body, he had learned, was an instrument that needed tending, not punishing without cause. "I have read what they wrote about you as well," said Jesus. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "The Meditations? They were not meant to be read. They were notes. Reminders to myself. I know. There is something honest about words not written to impress anyone." There was a silence. Not an uncomfortable one, the kind of silence that passes between people who do not need to fill the air with words to feel secure. "You governed an empire," said Jesus after a moment. "I attempted to govern an empire," Marcus corrected. "There is a considerable difference. Governing implies control. What I had was responsibility without control, which is, I discovered, the normal condition of anyone who leads anything." "I know that feeling," said Jesus. Something in the tone was not bitter, but recognized the weight of the sentence. Marcus looked at him with attention. "You never governed anything, by what I have read. No territory, no army, no administration. No. And yet you speak as someone who knows what responsibility without control feels like." Jesus was quiet for a moment. "I tried to change the hearts of people. Which is the one thing a human being genuinely cannot control in another human being." A pause. "You understand me." Marcus understood. He had spent years trying to change Rome's culture through laws, examples, philosophy. And had learned, at considerable cost, that cultures change slowly, when they change at all, and that personal example is the only tool that truly works, and even that one is slow. Then we have this in common, he said. We tried to change the world and discovered that the only true battlefield is the human soul. Including our own, added Jesus. Marcus tilted his head. Yes. Including one's own. There was an honesty in that observation he appreciated, the refusal to place the preacher above the preached to. Why are you here? Asked Marcus. There was no hostility in the question. Only the direct curiosity of someone who prefers honest questions to oblique conversation. Why are we here, you mean, replied Jesus. Why are we here? Jesus looked at the fountain. Because there are questions neither of us answered completely. And because sometimes the best way to think better is to think with someone who disagrees with you in interesting ways. Marcus considered this. In Stoic philosophy, dialogue was fundamental, not to win arguments, but to test ideas against the friction of another's reality. There was, he admitted, a certain loneliness in having arrived at so many conclusions alone, in a diary no one would read. You will disagree with me, he said. It was not an accusation. Frequently, said Jesus. And there was something like satisfaction in the word, as though the prospect of genuine disagreement were refreshing. And you will ask me questions instead of answering mine. Sometimes, Jesus admitted. Open questions frequently go further than closed answers. Marcus paused. Epictetus had a version of that. He said that 2 ears and 1 mouth suggest we should listen twice as much as we speak. Epictetus was wise. He was a slave before he was a philosopher. Suffering taught him things that I, raised in abundance, had to learn by other means. Suffering is a teacher no one chooses and almost everyone resists, said Jesus. But when you stop resisting it, it has much to say. There was something in that phrase Marcus wanted to record, the diarist's instinct that had accompanied him for decades. But there was no papyrus here. No pen. There was only the conversation. Then begin, said Marcus. What do you want to discuss? Jesus looked at him with those eyes that seemed to see not only what was in front of them but what lay beneath. You spent your whole life practicing discipline, he said. Waking before sunrise, controlling impulses, hardening character against comfort. And yet, from what I read in your notes, you never arrived at a peace that lasted. Marcus felt the impact of the observation, not as attack but as precise diagnosis. No, he admitted after a moment. Peace was a practice, not a destination. I reached it in the morning and lost it before lunch, frequently. Why do you think that happened? Marcus thought. It was the right question. Because discipline, alone, builds armor. And armor protects, but also isolates. I controlled my impulses. But there was something beneath the impulses that discipline did not touch. Jesus tilted his head slightly, like someone recognizing a path they have already traveled. What? Asked Marcus. Fear, said Jesus. Discipline controls impulses. But it does not heal fear. And fear is what lies beneath almost everything. Marcus was quiet. That was a claim that deserved time. Then what heals fear? He asked at last. Jesus looked at the fountain, at the water that never held still. Love, he said. Simply. Without ornament. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. That seems insufficient. All true answers seem insufficient at first glance, said Jesus. That is why they take a lifetime to understand. The afternoon, if there was an afternoon in that place, began to cool. The fig tree cast shade enough for both now. Marcus looked at the horizon that had no defined line, and felt something he did not immediately recognize. After a moment, he recognized it, curiosity. The alive, undefended curiosity of someone who has just found a worthy interlocutor. Well, he said, with something close to lightness. This is going to be a long conversation. The best ones are, said Jesus. Marcus adjusted his position on the stone. He had spent 40 years in the company of Stoic philosophers, men of precision and economy, who chose words the way a physician chooses a scalpel. The man across from him was different. He spoke in images. He answered questions with other questions. He used silence the way the Stoics used argument, as something that works on you if you let it. There is something I want to say at the beginning, said Marcus. A kind of declaration of intent. Go ahead. I come without the intention of being converted, said Marcus. I have my philosophy. It has served me, imperfectly, but more than imperfectly. I am not here to abandon it. He paused. But I come also without the intention of defending it at the expense of truth. If you show me something true that Stoicism missed, I want to see it. Jesus looked at him with something close to satisfaction. That is exactly the right posture. What is your posture? Asked Marcus. Jesus considered. To share what I know, he said, without insisting that you receive it in any particular form. A pause. Truth has a way of arriving in the shape that a specific person can receive it. My task is to offer, what you do with it is yours. Marcus nodded. It was a generous position. More generous than he had expected, given the claims that had been made on this man's behalf by his followers. Then let us also agree, said Marcus, that neither of us speaks for our traditions as institutions. I am not representing the Stoic school. You are not representing, he paused, choosing words carefully, the institutions that were built in your name. Jesus's expression moved in a way Marcus could not quite read. Something between relief and something more complicated. Agreed, said Jesus. I speak only for what I actually said. What was built afterward is a separate conversation. Then we are two men, said Marcus, in a square outside time. With nothing to defend except what we genuinely believe. That, said Jesus, is rarer than it sounds. Marcus thought about all the conversations he had conducted as emperor, in which his position preceded his argument, in which what he said was received through the filter of what he represented. To speak as simply himself, without rank, without tradition, without institution, he had tried to achieve that in the Meditations. But even there, the emperor was never entirely absent. Here, in this place, the emperor had been left at the door. I notice something about you, said Marcus after a moment. Yes. You are not trying to make me comfortable, said Marcus. Most people who came to speak to me were either trying to impress me or placate me. You are doing neither. I treat people as they actually are, said Jesus. Which in your case means, someone capable of handling difficult truth without needing it softened. Marcus looked at him. And if I were not capable of that? Then I would find another way, said Jesus. But I do not think that will be necessary. It was a form of respect Marcus had not encountered often. Not the respect of deference or flattery, the respect of genuine expectation. The assumption that you are capable of more than you are currently demonstrating. The man who treated the lepers, said Marcus slowly, did not treat them as fragile. No, said Jesus. I treated them as people who deserved the same honesty everyone else deserves. He paused. Pity diminishes. Respect assumes. Marcus considered this. Then you respect me by disagreeing with me. I respect you by taking your questions seriously, said Jesus. Which may include disagreeing with your answers. He paused. Is that acceptable? More than acceptable, said Marcus. It is what I came for. The light in that place did not change with time, but something in its quality shifted, the way light shifts in a room when a window is opened and fresh air enters. Both men felt it. Neither commented on it. Then begin, said Marcus. What do you want to discuss? Jesus looked at him with those eyes that seemed to see not only what was in front of them but what lay beneath. You spent your whole life practicing discipline, he said. Waking before sunrise, controlling impulses, hardening character against comfort. And yet, from what I read in your notes, you never arrived at a peace that lasted. Marcus felt the impact of the observation, not as attack but as precise diagnosis. No, he admitted after a moment. Peace was a practice, not a destination. I reached it in the morning and lost it before lunch, frequently. Why do you think that happened? Marcus thought. It was the right question. Because discipline, alone, builds armor. And armor protects, but also isolates. I controlled my impulses. But there was something beneath the impulses that discipline did not touch. Jesus tilted his head slightly, like someone recognizing a path they have already traveled. What? Asked Marcus. Fear, said Jesus. Discipline controls impulses. But it does not heal fear. And fear is what lies beneath almost everything. Marcus was quiet. That was a claim that deserved time. Then what heals fear? He asked at last. Jesus looked at the fountain, at the water that never held still. Love, he said. Simply. Without ornament. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. That seems insufficient. All true answers seem insufficient at first glance, said Jesus. That is why they take a lifetime to understand. Reflexo. Reflection. Marcus Aurelius and Jesus represent two of the greatest traditions of practical wisdom the Western world has produced. One came from philosophy, the other, from faith. But what unites them is more interesting than what separates them. Both were interested not in theories about the good life, but in the good life itself. The encounter between Stoicism and Christianity is not a new idea. The early Christians drank from Stoicism. Paul of Tarsus quoted Stoics. And Marcus Aurelius, without knowing it, anticipated in many points what the Sermon on the Mount had said a century earlier. The meeting between the two was always, in some sense, inevitable. What this book proposes is that you join this conversation, not as a spectator, but as someone who has the same questions they had. Practice. Before reading further, write on a piece of paper the question about how to live that troubles you most right now. It does not need an answer. It only needs to be honest. Keep that paper. Return to it at the end of the book. Chapter 1, Discipline and Grace. For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright and godly lives in this present age. Titus 2 verses 11-12. If it is not right, do not do it, if it is not true, do not say it. Let your impulse always be in your control. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, 12.17. Marcus Aurelius woke before sunrise. It was a habit he had maintained for decades, not because he enjoyed the early hours, but precisely because he did not. He had learned from Epictetus that virtue is not the path of least resistance, it is the path deliberately chosen when resistance exists. Waking early was, among other things, a daily exercise in not yielding to comfort. In the square, he explained this to Jesus with the clarity of someone who had long systematized the matter. Discipline is the foundation, said Marcus. Without it, all other virtues are unstable. A generous man without discipline is generous when he is in good spirits. A courageous man without discipline is courageous when he is not afraid. Discipline is what makes virtues reliable, what transforms them from feelings into character. Jesus listened with genuine attention. He was the kind of listener who makes people want to keep speaking, not because he validated everything, but because he seemed to truly process what he heard. And how is it practiced? He asked. Marcus explained, waking before sunrise. Cold water. Simple meals. Restraining laughter when the situation did not merit it. Restraining anger when the situation provoked it. Recording one's own failures before sleep, not to punish oneself, but to avoid repeating them. That sounds exhausting, said Jesus. It is exhausting at the beginning, agreed Marcus. Then it becomes nature. Epictetus said the first years are the hardest. You are swimming against the current. After a while, the current changes direction, because you have changed. Jesus was quiet for a moment. There was something in his silence that Marcus had learned to read, not yet disagreement, but not agreement either. It was the silence of someone about to look at the same object from a different angle. "May I ask you something?" said Jesus. "You may." "In your final years as emperor," he began slowly, "when you were camped on the Danube, with plague at your rear and barbarians ahead, and the son you had raised was showing signs that he would waste everything you had built," Jesus paused. "Was discipline enough?" Marcus did not answer immediately. That was the question he had never asked himself with such clarity, because sometimes the most precise questions are also the most difficult to face. "No," he said at last. "Discipline kept me functional. Kept me upright. Kept me making decisions when I wanted to stop making decisions. But enough?" A pause. "No. There were nights when I did everything right, woke early, controlled impulses, recorded failures, and still felt empty." "Why?" "Because discipline without purpose is merely organized resistance to chaos," said Marcus. "An organized resistance to chaos, when chaos is large enough, cannot win." "You said without purpose," said Jesus. "What was your purpose?" "The good of the empire. The flourishing of citizens. The preservation of civilization against barbarism." Marcus paused. "Large enough purposes. But impersonal. Abstract. When Commodus, my son, began to show who he was, I realized I had spent decades caring for an abstraction and neglecting something concrete." There was genuine weight in that admission. Not the confession of a weak man, the confession of someone courageous enough to see his own blind spots. Jesus did not try to console him. He simply observed, the problem was not the discipline. It was what the discipline was serving. "Yes," said Marcus. "But I don't know how it could have been different. Discipline seemed the only tool I had." "Not the only one," said Jesus. Marcus looked at him. "What else?" Jesus stood and walked to the fountain. He looked at the water for a moment before answering. "Grace," he said. Marcus waited. "Discipline says, I must be better." Jesus turned to him. "Grace says, you are loved as you are, and that love is what moves you to be better. They are different paths to the same place, but they arrive in very different ways." Marcus crossed his arms. "That sounds to me like a way to justify lack of effort. If you are already loved as you are, why strive to change?" "That is the wrong question," said Jesus calmly, without defensiveness. "What is the right question?" "The right question is, what moves a son to act well?" Jesus sat again. "Fear of punishment or love for the Father?" Marcus considered. "Both work," he said. "Stoicism does not depend on fear of punishment, but the idea that virtue produces flourishing and vice produces decay is a form of natural consequence. A kind of logic of the universe. They work to produce behavior," agreed Jesus. "But not to produce the same kind of person. A son who acts well from fear of punishment and a son who acts well from love for his father may do the same things on the surface. But inside they are completely different people." Marcus was quiet. There was something there he recognized, not from philosophy, but from experience. There were servants in Rome who obeyed from fear and servants who obeyed from genuine loyalty. The quality of work was similar on good days. On difficult days, the difference was vast. "So grace," he said slowly, "is what transforms obedience from obligation into choice." "More than that," said Jesus. "Grace is what makes it possible to love discipline rather than merely endure it." Marcus was still for a moment. It was a sentence that deserved time. "Do you think I endured discipline? You wrote in your notes that you had to remind yourself every day to wake early. That you had to remind yourself to control anger. That you had to fight the impulse to yield to comfort. Jesus paused. That does not sound like someone who loves discipline. It sounds like someone who maintains it by force of will. By force of will, said Marcus. Exactly. That is what Stoicism proposes. And when the force of will runs out? The question fell into the silence like a stone into water. Marcus did not answer immediately, because the honest answer was uncomfortable. When the force of will ran out, in the nights on the Danube, in the years of Commodus, in the plagues he could not control, what remained was an empty discipline. Correct movements performed by a man who had forgotten why he was performing them. What happens when grace runs out? He countered. Jesus smiled. That is the central difference. The discipline that comes from within you can run out, because you have limits. The grace that comes from outside, from a love that does not depend on your performance, does not have the same kind of limit. You are speaking of dependency, said Marcus. There was resistance in the voice, not hostility, but the natural resistance of a man who had spent his life cultivating self-sufficiency as a virtue. I am speaking of acknowledging what is real, said Jesus. You spent decades practicing the dichotomy of control, what depends on me and what does not. Discipline depends on you. But love, the love that moves discipline beyond obligation, that does not depend on you alone. Marcus stood and took a few steps. It was what he did when he needed to think with his body beyond his mind. Then you are saying that discipline without love is fundamentally incomplete. I am saying that discipline without love produces admirable Stoics and lonely people, said Jesus. There was no cruelty in the sentence. Only precision. Marcus stopped. He turned to Jesus. And love without discipline? Jesus did not hesitate. Produces inconstant kindness. People who love when it is easy and disappear when it is hard. Love without discipline is feeling, and feelings pass. A silence followed that lasted some time. It was the kind that happens when two men arrive together at something neither had seen quite so clearly alone. Then we need each other, said Marcus at last. It was not a concession, it was an observation. Discipline needs love to have a soul, said Jesus. Love needs discipline to have form. Body and spirit, said Marcus, almost to himself. Something like that, agreed Jesus. Marcus sat back down on his stone. Something had shifted slightly in his posture, not in the shoulders, but somewhere more subtle, as if an invisible knot had loosened a little. There was a silence in which Marcus turned something over carefully before speaking. It was his habit, to work through an objection before voicing it, so that when the words came, they were precise. I am familiar with one of your followers, he said at last. Paul, who was also known as Saul. His letters circulated through the empire during my grandfather's time. Some of my teachers had read them. He paused. Paul wrote extensively about both discipline and grace. Perhaps more than anyone who followed you. Jesus inclined his head. What does he say that is relevant here? He writes, I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. Marcus paused. That is nearly Stoic. The language of control, of mastery, of practice as the path to character. Epictetus would recognize it immediately. He would, agreed Jesus. But Paul also writes, by grace you have been saved, through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God. Marcus looked at Jesus. The same man. The same letters. Discipline as rigorous as anything in Stoic philosophy, and simultaneously a complete dependence on something given, not earned. Jesus was quiet for a moment with what seemed like something close to affection. You have read Paul carefully. I found the tension interesting, said Marcus. In philosophy, we spend considerable energy resolving contradictions. Paul seems to hold them simultaneously without resolution. Not without resolution, said Jesus. With resolution at a deeper level. He paused. Paul understood what I am saying, that discipline and grace are not alternatives. Discipline is the human response to grace. Grace is the divine ground from which discipline grows. He paused. When Paul says I discipline my body, he is not saying I earn my worth through discipline. He is saying because I have received something extraordinary, I want to be worthy of it. A pause. The discipline is the response to the gift, not the earning of it. Marcus was quiet. This was a formulation he had not encountered in philosophy, the idea of discipline as a form of gratitude rather than a form of achievement. Gratitude, he said slowly, as a foundation for self-discipline. Not fear of decay. Not logical obligation. Not even love of the good in the abstract. He paused. Gratitude for something specific already received. Yes, said Jesus. Paul's discipline had an entirely different quality from a Stoic philosopher's discipline, even when the external practice looked identical. The quality came from the source, said Marcus. The quality came from knowing himself loved before he had earned anything, said Jesus. Which meant the discipline was never defensive. Never about proving himself. It was more like, caring for something that had been given to him. He paused. When someone gives you something irreplaceable, you handle it differently than something you purchased. Marcus considered this for a time. It was an image that reached past his philosophy to something more intuitive. He had received certain things in his life that were given, not earned, the empire, through the adoption of Antoninus Pius, who had been adopted by Hadrian. He had not earned the empire. He had received it. And the awareness that it was not owed to him had shaped how he held it. There is something in that I recognize, said Marcus finally. The empire was given to me. I did not choose it. I received it. And that awareness, that I was a steward of something not properly mine, changed my relationship to the discipline of governance. How? Made it less about demonstrating my worthiness, said Marcus. Because demonstrating worthiness to a gift already received is unnecessary. The gift is given. What remains is care. Jesus looked at him steadily. That is closer to what I teach than you realize. There is something in what you said about being loved as you are, said Marcus after a moment. I was never very easy to love. I was demanding with myself and ended up being demanding with others. My wife, Faustina, said that living with a Stoic philosopher was living with someone who was always right and rarely present. Jesus looked at him with something that was not judgment. And what do you make of that now? That she was not wrong, said Marcus. Simply. Discipline made me just. But justice without gentleness is a form of coldness. And coldness, even when correct, creates distance. Grace is not the absence of standards, said Jesus. It is the presence of love within the standards. Marcus processed this. A Stoic formulation was beginning to emerge from the conversation, something about how virtue, separated from love, becomes its own obstacle. But it was not yet clear enough to articulate. Did you practice discipline? Asked Marcus. It was a natural inversion, he had spoken much, it was time to listen. What you call discipline I would call faithfulness, said Jesus. Waking early to pray. Withdrawing to the desert when I needed to think. Resisting the temptations at the beginning of my ministry. Going to Jerusalem when every sign pointed to danger. Pause. But the force that fed that faithfulness was not willpower. It was love. For the Father. For the people. Did that make it easier? Asked Marcus. It made it clearer, said Jesus. Not easier. Gethsemane was not easy. The reference was to the garden where he had prayed before the crucifixion, where he had asked for the cup to be taken away. But it was clear. I knew why I was doing what I was doing. And that why sustained the how when the how was unbearable. Marcus was quiet with this. He had written something similar in the Meditations, that purpose is the anchor in days of storm. But there was a difference between the abstract purpose he described and the concrete love Jesus described. Your purpose had a face, said Marcus. Many faces, said Jesus. The fisherman. The widow with the only son. The lepers no one touched. A pause. When purpose has a face, it is harder to abandon. Marcus looked at his hands, the hands that had signed decrees, held swords, written the Meditations by torchlight in a cold camp. I should have looked at more faces, he said. Not with dramatic regret, but with the sobriety of someone conducting an honest inventory. You looked, said Jesus. The Meditations are full of faces. The difference is that you saw them as duties. I saw them as loves. Do duties and loves produce the same actions? They produce similar actions. But they produce different people. Jesus stood. And in the end, what remains is not what you did. It is who you became while doing it. The afternoon held still in that timeless place. The fig tree extended its shade without hurry. Marcus looked at Jesus and thought that there was, in this conversation, a tension that would not resolve easily, and that was precisely why it was worth continuing. Reflexo. Reflection. The tension between discipline and grace is one of the most productive in spiritual history. Stoicism tells us, practice, harden, control, and character will come. The Gospel tells us, be loved first, and character will come from love. Both are right in crucial ways. Both are incomplete without the other. The person who has only discipline becomes efficient and hard. The person who has only grace becomes gentle and unstable. The person who integrates the two, who lets love feed discipline, and discipline give form to love, is the person Marcus and Jesus, each in their own way, were trying to become. Practice. Identify one area of your life where you act from obligation rather than love. Don't change the behavior yet. Just ask the question, if I genuinely loved this practice or this person, how would it be different? The answer may surprise you. Chapter 2, Suffering as Teacher. For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. Philippians 1 verse 29. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, v.20. The conversation about suffering began with a fly. It was a small, unremarkable fly that landed on the back of Marcus Aurelius's hand while he was speaking. He observed it for a second, its insignificance, the disturbance it caused with no intention, and then brushed it away with a calm gesture. Epictetus taught me to use flies, said Marcus. Small irritations as practice for the large ones. If you learn not to be disturbed by the fly, you are training the muscle you will need when the real storm arrives. Jesus looked at the spot where the fly had landed. And did the real storm arrive? Several, said Marcus. The Antonine plague killed 5 million people during my reign. 5 million. He paused with the weight of the number. I saw carts with bodies through the streets of Rome. Saw physicians who did not know what to do. Saw entire families disappearing within weeks. And I needed to keep governing. Needed to appear stable when the world was not. How did you endure it? With philosophy, said Marcus. But there was something in the answer that sounded, even to him, slightly hollow. As if the word philosophy were too large to describe what had really happened in those years. Jesus waited. It was one of his most irritating and most useful habits, not filling silence when the silence still had work to do. With philosophy, Marcus repeated, and with something I cannot name well. A kind of presence I sought when the intellectual tools were exhausted. As though reasoning would carry you to the edge of a precipice, and there you needed something different from reasoning to take the next step. Jesus tilted his head. What did you find at the edge of the precipice? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. Sometimes, stillness. Sometimes a different clarity, not thought, but felt. Sometimes, nothing. Just the precipice. And you continued anyway. I continued anyway. Jesus looked at the boundaryless horizon. When I was in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before the crucifixion, I asked for the cup to be taken from me. He paused. It was not taken. Marcus looked at him. Did you feel abandoned? Yes, said Jesus without hesitation. My God, why have you forsaken me is not a phrase from someone at peace with suffering. It is a phrase from someone in the middle of it for real. There was something in that admission Marcus had not expected. The image of Jesus that had reached him was of someone always serene, even on the cross. The phrase of abandonment made the suffering more real, and, strangely, more useful. The Stoics would say that suffering is not an evil in itself, said Marcus. It is indifferent. What matters is how you respond to it. I agree, said Jesus. But there is a difference between saying suffering is indifferent and actually going through it. There is. Marcus did not try to defend the position. When I wrote in the Meditations that pain is merely a sensation the mind can transcend, I was right in theory. In practice, when Commodus was destroying everything I had built while I was still alive to see it, the pain did not feel indifferent. It felt very personal. Jesus nodded. Because it was. But suffering taught things that prosperity never taught, said Marcus. The plague taught me what was essential. War taught me who the real men beside me were. Betrayal by those I trusted taught me about human nature with a precision no book could match. Avoided suffering does not form, said Jesus. Traversed suffering transforms. Marcus pointed at him. You said that as though it were easy to accept. It is not, said Jesus. Gethsemane was the moment I most wanted it to be easy. I wanted there to be another path. There was not. How did you know there was not? I knew there were other possibilities, said Jesus. I could have fled. Could have retreated. Could have used the power I had in different ways. He paused. But I also knew that each of those alternatives traded an immediate pain for a larger one. The pain of compromised integrity. And that pain is the worst of all. Marcus recognized this immediately. He had made decisions throughout his life, decisions that could have relieved pressure in the short term, that could have made influential people happy, that could have made his life as emperor slightly more comfortable. And he had refused each one. Not because he was heroic. Because he knew the long-term cost of betraying one's own conscience was greater than the cost of any external suffering. Integrity has a price, said Marcus. And sometimes the price is very high. It is, agreed Jesus. But the alternative has a price too. And that price is paid in a different way. Marcus stood and began to walk slowly around the fountain. It was his way of thinking with his body beyond his mind. There is something in suffering I cannot resolve completely with Stoic philosophy, he said after a few steps. Stoicism says that suffering is an opportunity to practice virtue. And that is true. But, he stopped, what about when suffering is not an opportunity for anything? When it is simply destructive? When it kills children who did nothing wrong? It was the oldest question about suffering. Marcus asked it without expecting it to be answered easily. Jesus was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was slowly. When I am in the presence of a child who suffers without apparent cause, I do not have an answer that makes it acceptable, he said. I have no explanation that renders that child's suffering acceptable. Pause. What I have is presence. I place my hand on the child. I stay alongside. Marcus stopped walking. That is not enough. No, said Jesus. But it is what there is. And sometimes what there is what makes the difference between someone bearing the unbearable or breaking completely. Marcus looked at him. You are saying that presence is a form of response to suffering. I am saying it is often the only honest form of response to suffering, said Jesus. Explanations for why suffering exists may be true or false. But presence alongside the one who suffers is always true. Something in that sentence mildly irritated Marcus. But presence without understanding is merely sentimentalism. And understanding without presence is merely intellectualism, replied Jesus, without raising his voice. You needed both, Marcus. In the camps on the Danube, you needed to understand suffering well enough to keep functioning. But your soldiers needed to see that you were there, that their weight was also your weight. Marcus stood still. It was true. He had gone out from the camp many times to walk among the soldiers, not for political strategy, but because there was something in that walk that reminded him of why he was doing all of this. The faces again, he said, almost to himself. The faces again, confirmed Jesus. Marcus returned to his stone. The collective suffering of the plague changed me in a way that decades of discipline had not. I did not become wiser immediately. I became more porous. As if the walls between myself and the world had grown thinner. Suffering does that, said Jesus. When you are well, the walls grow thick. You protect yourself. Suffering thins the walls. And suddenly you feel things that before passed without leaving a mark. That is vulnerability, said Marcus. He did not say this as a compliment. It is, said Jesus. And you think vulnerability is weakness. I think vulnerability is risk. It is both, said Jesus. And both are necessary. He leaned slightly forward. Marcus, do you know what happens to a wall that never has cracks? Marcus thought. It grows strong. It grows opaque, said Jesus. You stop seeing what is on the other side. And you begin to act as if the other side does not exist. It was an image Marcus had not considered from quite that angle. He had built walls, of discipline, of reason, of self-control, that had kept him functional during decades of chaos. But there were moments, he admitted to himself, when he had lost the ability to feel what was on the other side of the walls. The plague tore some stones from my wall, said Marcus. And I never completely put them back. That is growth, said Jesus. That is pain, said Marcus. Growth and pain are often the same thing with different names. Marcus looked at him for a moment. You went through the most extreme pain a human being can imagine, flogged, crucified, abandoned. And you say it was transforming. I say it was necessary, said Jesus. The distinction was careful in the word. I do not say it was good in the way a walk on a sunny day is good. I say it did something nothing else could have done. What did it do? It showed that love can go further than any suffering, said Jesus. That there is a depth to love that only becomes visible when you take it to the limit. Pause. Anyone can love when it is easy. The question is what happens when it ceases to be. Marcus was very quiet. There was something in that sentence that touched a question he had avoided, not from cowardice, but because it was the most difficult question. To love without conditions, he said. Stoicism speaks of caring for all human beings as members of one body. But caring is not the same as loving. It is not, agreed Jesus. Caring is more manageable, said Marcus. Love is more dangerous. Why dangerous? Because when you love, the suffering of the other becomes your suffering, said Marcus. And you lose control over what you will feel. He paused. Stoicism taught me to maintain sovereignty over my internal states. Love threatens that sovereignty. Jesus was quiet for a moment. Then, perhaps sovereignty is not the goal. It was a sentence Marcus needed to consider carefully. Sovereignty over internal states had been the core of his philosophical practice for decades. To question that goal was to question much more than one idea. What would the goal be, then? Communion, said Jesus. Simply. Communion implies loss of boundaries. It implies permeable boundaries, said Jesus. Not absence of boundaries. He paused. Marcus, when those soldiers fell ill from the plague and you went to walk among them, what did you feel? Marcus did not need to think much. Pain. Helplessness. Something that felt like anger, not at anyone, but at the situation. A pause. And also something I cannot name well. A kind of belonging to their suffering. That is communion, said Jesus. That robbed me of sleep for weeks. Yes. Jesus looked at him without blinking. And it was also what kept you sane when everything else was falling apart. Marcus considered this for a long time. The fountain murmured beside them. Somewhere in the shadow of the fig tree, an insect sang a repeated note. Suffering as teacher, said Marcus at last. But it is a cruel teacher. The best ones are, said Jesus. The best teachers take you beyond what you thought was possible. And that is not comfortable. Marcus nodded slowly. Not easy agreement. The recognition of someone who had spent decades fighting the truth of a thing before finally stopping. A silence fell between them. Then Marcus spoke of something he had never written in the Meditations, not because he had forgotten it, but because it was the kind of thing that resisted the form of philosophical notes. During the worst of the plague, he said, there was a moment that determined, more than anything else, my relationship to suffering. He paused. A physician came to me with a report. The medicine we had was sufficient for perhaps a third of the soldiers who were ill. He asked me to decide the criteria, which third would receive treatment. Jesus was completely still. There was no right answer, said Marcus. Whatever criteria I chose, those most likely to survive, those of highest rank, those with families, those randomly selected, each choice meant choosing who would be left to die. He paused. I spent 3 days on that decision. And whatever I chose, the suffering of those 3 days never became less by reasoning through it more carefully. The mathematics were clear. The suffering of making the choice was not mathematical. What did you choose? Asked Jesus. Those most likely to survive with treatment, said Marcus. The utilitarian answer. The answer that saved the most lives in total. He paused. And it was the right answer by every measure I could apply. And it was one of the things I carried for the rest of my life. Jesus was quiet for a time. When he spoke, it was slowly. A centurion came to me once, he said. A Roman officer who commanded 100 men. His servant was dying. He came not to ask me to come to the house, he knew I would come, and he knew that my coming would use my time and energy that could serve others on the road. Jesus paused. He said, only say the word, and my servant will be healed. I am a man of authority, I give orders and they are executed at a distance. A pause. He understood something about power and suffering that most people miss, that genuine authority can operate at the cost of the one who holds it. Marcus looked at him. He was asking you to bear the cost so his servant would not have to. He was asking me to redirect suffering, said Jesus. Which is what your medical decision was also doing. You could not eliminate the suffering. You redirected it, from those who might survive to those who could not. And the suffering of making that choice was your share of the weight. I was the centurion, said Marcus slowly. Directing what I could not prevent. And the physician who brought the report to you, said Jesus, was doing what the centurion's servant could not do, serving the one in authority who still had to carry what the lesser could not carry for the greater. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Suffering distributed by rank, he said finally. The higher you rise, the more suffering you absorb that would otherwise fall on those below you. That is one of the things servant leadership actually means, said Jesus. Not performance of humility. The actual absorption of weight that would otherwise crush those with fewer resources to carry it. Then the emperor suffers more than the soldier, said Marcus. Differently, said Jesus. The soldier suffers in the body. The emperor suffers in the choices. A pause. Both are real. Neither is greater. But only one of you has a philosophy to help you carry yours. Marcus considered. And you? I absorbed the weight of all of it, said Jesus. Which was the point of Gethsemane. The request to remove the cup was the request of a man who understood exactly what weight he was about to carry, not abstractly, but specifically. Every medical decision ever made badly. Every centurion's servant who did not receive the healing. Every soldier left without medicine. Marcus was very still. You are describing a specific kind of suffering, he said. The suffering of complete awareness of what you cannot fix. The suffering of love without limits, said Jesus. Which is the most comprehensive suffering available? Marcus stood. He needed a moment before speaking again. That, he said finally, is something Stoic philosophy cannot prepare you for. It can prepare you for your own suffering. It can even prepare you for the suffering of those close to you. He paused. But there is no Stoic category for the suffering of unlimited compassion. No, agreed Jesus. For that, you need something other than a philosophy. Reflexo. Reflection. Suffering is the theme that unites Stoicism and Christianity in unexpected ways. Marcus Aurelius teaches that the obstacle is the way, that impedance is not something to avoid, but to traverse, and in the traversal, to grow. The gospel goes further. God himself chose suffering, not as a demonstration of power, but as a demonstration of love that does not retreat before difficulty. What both agree on, suffering avoided does not form. Suffering traversed transforms. The difference lies in what you carry with you while you traverse, and who is at your side. Practice. Think of a suffering you went through in the past that, looking back, formed you in some way. Write what that experience taught you that nothing else could have taught in the same way. Not to romanticize pain, but to recover what it left of value. Chapter 3, The Death That Frees. For to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. Philippians 1 verse 21. Think constantly on those who were great. Where are they now? Smoke, ashes, a legend, or not even that. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, 9.33. Marcus Aurelius thought about death every day. Not morbidly, for him it was a hygienic practice. Like brushing teeth or reviewing battle plans. The meditatio mortis, meditation on death, was one of the central tools of Stoicism. By constantly remembering that you will die, you free yourself from the trivialities that dominate the mind of those who forget this. If you know you will die tomorrow, said Marcus to Jesus, the small irritations of today lose the power they have over you. The senator who contradicts you in the meeting. The food that did not come as ordered. The servant who arrived late. He made a gesture. None of this matters when you have death as perspective. You practice this daily, said Jesus. It was not a question. Every day. Sometimes, upon waking, before doing anything, I would ask myself, if this were my last day, how would I live? And the answer organized the day's priorities in a way the calendar never could. Jesus was quiet for a moment, with that processing silence. Then, I died. Marcus looked at him. Yes. And then came back. Yes. Marcus waited, because there was obviously much more in that sentence. So there is something you practice as a mental exercise, said Jesus, and something I went through as concrete experience. He paused. The two things are very different. I imagine, said Marcus. What did you find? It was the question Marcus had wanted to ask since the beginning of the conversation. Not from morbid curiosity, but because it was the question no philosophy could answer from within, only from without. And there he sat, before him, someone who had been on the other side and returned. Jesus was quiet for longer than usual. Marcus did not press. There are things for which I have no words precise enough, said Jesus at last. And things that would be misunderstood regardless of what words I used. He looked at Marcus. But I can tell you what death revealed while it was happening. Tell me. That love is stronger than it, said Jesus. Not in the poetic sense in which people say this. In the literal sense. Death is real. The pain was real. The abandonment was real. And even in the midst of all that, there was something that did not yield. He paused. I did not yield to despair at the moment when it would have been completely justified to yield. Marcus considered. The Stoics would say that virtue is stronger than death, he said. That a virtuous man can be physically destroyed but cannot be internally destroyed. There is overlap, said Jesus. But there is a difference. Stoic virtue says, nothing external can take from me what I truly am. What I found is more specific, nothing can extinguish the love that moves me, not even the worst the world can do. Marcus tilted his head. You are describing perseverance. I am describing something closer to a root, said Jesus. A tree with deep enough roots does not fall in the wind. But the root is not abstract virtue. The root is concrete love. Love for whom? For the Father. For the people. Jesus made a gesture toward the space between them. For you, in a way, though we did not know each other. Marcus considered that for a moment. The idea of being loved by someone who did not know him was strange, but there was a curious dignity in it. A dignity that did not depend on merit. The meditatio mortis taught me not to waste time, said Marcus. What did the experience of death teach you? Jesus did not answer immediately. There was something in the silence that was not hesitation, but weight, the weight of an answer that needed careful calibration. That death is a door, not a wall, he said finally. Marcus nodded. It was a metaphor he recognized, death as transition, not as end. But coming from Jesus it carried a different weight than it carried in philosophical speculations about the immortality of the soul. The Stoics debated what lies after death, said Marcus. Some believed the soul dissolved into the universal logos. Others that there was some form of continuity. I honestly never knew what to believe. And now? Now I am conversing with someone who died and returned, said Marcus with something close to humor. Which was not exactly what the philosophical theories anticipated. Jesus smiled. What death revealed to me about life, he said after a moment, was the importance of each individual moment. When you know you will die, each conversation carries a different weight. Each meal. Each glance. That is exactly what the meditatio mortis produces. Said Marcus, with the contained enthusiasm of someone recognizing a familiar idea in an unexpected context. Yes, agreed Jesus. But there is a difference between knowing you will die and having actually died. After having gone through it, each moment back in life has a different quality. Not urgency. Something closer to gratuitousness. Gratuitousness, repeated Marcus. As though being alive were a gift, not a given. Exactly. Jesus looked at the stones around them. Before dying, I knew intellectually that life was a gift. Afterward, I felt that in every breath. Marcus was quiet. There was something in that he recognized from specific moments, not as a constant practice, but as flashes. The moments after escaping a particularly dangerous battle. The moments of unexpected clarity in the middle of a crisis he did not know if he would survive. There are moments when death passes close and you feel life differently for a few days afterward, said Marcus. But it fades. The daily returns and absorbs everything. Because the daily is made to absorb everything, said Jesus. That is its function. And that is why practices like your meditatio mortis exist, to pierce the daily regularly and remember what lies beneath. But the real experience pierces deeper, said Marcus. Pierces differently, said Jesus. Not necessarily more useful for living well. Just differently. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You are saying that philosophical practice can produce something comparable to the concrete experience? I am saying that each has its path, said Jesus. You will never die and come back. But you can live with such awareness of death that it transforms you similarly. Not identically. Similarly. Marcus stood and walked to the fountain. He looked at his own image in the water. There is something you have not yet told me, he said without turning. About the 3 days. Jesus was quiet. You want to know what lies after death, said Jesus at last. I do. And I have already said, there are no precise words. Then use imprecise words, said Marcus. There was almost a smile on Jesus's face when he spoke. There is love, he said. There is presence. There is a recognition that everything that seemed enormous on this side is, from the other, much simpler. Pause. And there is something that is impossible to bring back in the same words because the words of here are made for the world of here. Marcus turned to him. That is frustrating. Yes, said Jesus, without apologizing. Truth frequently is. There is something you have not yet told me about the 3 days, said Marcus at last. Not what lies after death in general. But what you were, what was present, in the interval between death and return. Jesus looked at him carefully. What specifically do you want to know? Whether you were conscious, said Marcus. And if so, what kind of consciousness it was. Jesus was quiet for longer than usual. Not reluctant, measuring. Not sequential, he said finally. Not requiring time to move from one thought to the next. He paused. Imagine you have spent your life reading a book, 1 page at a time. Then you are shown the entire book simultaneously, all pages present at once, not before and after. He paused. That is closer to what I can describe. Marcus was very still. Everything present at once. Everything that had been, everything that was, everything that would be, said Jesus. Without the sequence that time imposes. A pause. And in that simultaneity, something I had understood intellectually became, complete. Not a conviction. More like the air, not something you hold, but something you are held by. And returning, said Marcus, what was that like? Like learning to read 1 page at a time again, said Jesus. A return to sequence after simultaneity. He paused. Not a diminishment. A choice. The story was not complete. There were specific people in specific moments who needed a specific presence, not a simultaneous one. Marcus nodded slowly. You chose to be limited again. I chose incarnation again, said Jesus. The logos choosing to be located. Finite enough to be touched. Present enough to be useful. Marcus stood and walked briefly to the fountain. He looked at his own reflection, that specific, finite face. There is a moment in the Meditations, he said without turning, that I wrote in the 3rd year on the Danube. I wrote, think often of how fast all things pass and perish. He paused. I wrote it as a reminder against vanity. But there were times when I wrote it and what I felt was not equanimity. It was something closer to grief. Grief for what? Asked Jesus. For the fact that everything specific disappears, said Marcus. That every particular face, every singular moment of clarity, every irreplaceable person, all of it resolves into the same undifferentiated past. He turned back to Jesus. If your description of the 3 days is accurate, if everything is present simultaneously in what lies beyond time, then nothing is lost. It is only inaccessible from here. Nothing is lost, said Jesus. Which is not the same as saying nothing ends. Things end in their temporal form. But the love that moved them, the truth that lived in them, the significance they carried, those are not temporal. Marcus returned to his stone. The conversation moved, now, to the oldest challenge. The Greek philosophers said death was the end of all evils, said Marcus. Epicurus argued that death is nothing to us because when it is present, we are not. He paused. Does that seem true, from the other side? Jesus considered the question carefully. Epicurus was right that death is not suffering, he said. He was wrong about the nothing. A pause. But what is there is not what most people imagine. What do most people imagine? A place. A destination. A continuation of life as it is. Jesus looked at Marcus. It is more like waking after a very long dream. Where the dream was real while you were in it, and the waking reveals a larger reality that includes the dream but does not confuse itself with it. Marcus held that image for some time. So life, he said slowly, is the dream. Not exactly, said Jesus. Life is real. Real enough to be worth living completely. But there is a larger reality that life points toward without being able to contain. Marcus felt something he did not quite know how to name, not exactly peace, but a relief from a tension he had carried so long he had forgotten he was carrying it. The tension of not knowing what was on the other side, combined with the philosophical commitment to act well regardless of what was there. What would you do differently, asked Jesus suddenly, if you knew with certainty there is something afterward? Marcus thought. It was a good question, and the honest answer surprised him. Probably little, he said. The good life is good regardless of what comes after. That has always been the Stoic position, and I still think it is right. A pause. But perhaps I would have less fear than I did not admit to having. Of what were you afraid? Of forgetting, said Marcus. Not of death itself. But of the possibility that everything would disappear without leaving a trace. A pause. The meditations were not meant to be published. But when I wrote them, there was something in them that wanted to survive. A conversation with the future I could not have in any other way. Jesus looked at him with that expression of seeing more than the visible. They survived, he said. 2,000 years, said Marcus, with something between satisfaction and melancholy. Not by chance, said Jesus. Because they were honest. Because they showed a man who struggled, not a hero who won. Pause. People recognize the struggle. And recognition is a form of immortality that people rarely consider. You live insofar as you are recognized by those who come after. Marcus looked at Jesus. And you? I chose a different path, said Jesus. I wrote nothing. I chose people. He paused. The immortality I sought was not in text, it was in the transformation of lives. A long pause. And that also survived. The two were quiet for a time. The fountain continued. The fig tree was still in the heatless warmth of that place. Death, said Marcus at last, gave me the best philosophy I have. Life, said Jesus, gave me the best theology I have. He paused. Perhaps we are both the result of having faced directly what most people spend a life avoiding. Death and life, said Marcus. They are the same thing seen from different angles. Reflexo. Reflection. The Stoic Meditatio Mortis and the Christian experience of resurrection arrive at surprisingly close places by radically different paths. Both say, remember you will die, and live accordingly. The difference lies in what they expect on the other side, and how that expectation shapes the life on this side. For Marcus, death was the horizon that gave perspective to life. For Jesus, death was the portal that revealed something larger. For both, the practical result was the same: live with presence and without wasting what you have. Practice. This week, set aside 5 minutes a day for the Meditatio Mortis exercise. Sit in silence and remember that you will die. Not as a morbid exercise, but as an invitation to clarity. Ask yourself, if this were my last day, what would I do differently? And then ask, why am I waiting? Chapter 4, Control and Surrender. Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. Luke 22 verse 42. Ask God only for what is worthy of being asked, health of soul, to use external gifts with equanimity, to fear death not at all. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, 9.40. There was a tension between them that had not appeared in the earlier chapters. It arose when Marcus Aurelius began to speak about the dichotomy of control, the central Stoic idea that distinguishes what depends on you from what does not, and Jesus listened with a different attention, more acute, like someone who recognizes terrain they know well but whose map the other person describes divergently. The principle is simple, said Marcus. There are things that depend on me, my thoughts, my choices, my responses. There are things that do not depend on me, what other people do, the weather, bodily health, reputation, wealth. He looked at Jesus. Freedom begins when you stop trying to control what you cannot control. I agree with the diagnosis, said Jesus. Most human suffering comes from trying to control the uncontrollable. But something is missing from that framework, said Jesus. Marcus waited. The framework says, accept what you cannot control. Jesus paused. But it does not say to whom or to what you surrender what you cannot control. Marcus frowned slightly. You surrender it to the logos. To the universal reason that governs the universe. To the nature of things. To an impersonal universe, said Jesus. Which does not know you and has no plans for you. The logos does not need to have personal plans to be the correct structure of everything, said Marcus. A tree grows according to its nature without anyone having personally planned for that specific tree. And that is enough for you. Marcus was quiet. It was the question he did not like to examine closely, because the honest answer was complicated. In philosophical practice, yes, he said after a moment. But in Gethsemane you did not surrender to an impersonal logos. No, said Jesus. You surrendered to the Father. Yes. There is an enormous difference between surrendering to an impersonal universe and surrendering to a Father, said Marcus. One is intelligent resignation. The other is personal trust. Exactly, said Jesus. There was something in the simplicity with which Jesus said that which unsettled Marcus, not the statement itself, but what it implied. If there was a personal Father to whom to surrender, then the human relationship with the universe was not that of a philosopher who understands the laws of the cosmos. It was that of a child who trusts a Father who may not always be visible but is always present. And Marcus was not certain he saw himself that way. You are saying that Stoic surrender is incomplete because it is not surrender to someone, he said. I am saying there is a qualitative difference between the two, said Jesus. You can accept what you cannot control with intelligent resignation. Or you can trust what you cannot control to someone you believe is worthy of trust. A pause. The resulting actions may look the same. The internal experience is completely different. Marcus stood. It was what he did when an idea productively unsettled him. The problem with your version, he said, walking slowly, is that it depends on believing in a personal Father who is worthy of trust. And that belief is not accessible through pure reasoning. No, agreed Jesus. It is not. So it is a faith. Yes. And faith, said Marcus, with something that was not exactly irony but approached it, faith can be mistaken. Can believe in things that are not true. It can, said Jesus. And pure reasoning can also be mistaken. He looked at Marcus. You spent decades reasoning about what was correct to do. And you still made wrong decisions. Marcus stopped. Yes. Because pure reasoning is not sufficient by itself, said Jesus. It needs information it does not have, perspective it cannot reach, love it cannot calculate. Pause. Faith is not the absence of reasoning. It is the recognition that reasoning has limits. Marcus returned to his stone. But in Gethsemane you were not merely acknowledging limits, he said. You were asking for the cup to be taken away. You were afraid. You were, in a sense, resisting. Yes. Does that not contradict the surrender? Jesus looked at him with something close to satisfaction, the satisfaction of someone who finds a good question. Which is more honest? Said Jesus. Pretending you are at peace with something painful, or saying you are not at peace and doing it anyway? Marcus was quiet. The Stoics seek ataraxia, imperturbability, as an ideal, said Jesus. As though emotion were the problem and the absence of emotion were the solution. He paused. But I wept before Lazarus's tomb. I was in anguish in Gethsemane. I expressed abandonment on the cross. A pause. And I was not being weak. I was being real. Marcus considered this. He had written in the Meditations that emotions, the passions, as the Stoics called them, were mistaken judgments that needed to be corrected. Sadness was a mistaken judgment that loss was an evil. Fear was a mistaken judgment that danger was greater than one's capacity to respond. But there had been nights on the Danube when he had wept. Not with abandon, sparingly, in the dark, without witnesses. And there had been, he admitted now, something tight in his chest that lasted longer than the good days. You are saying that genuine emotions and genuine surrender can coexist, said Marcus. I am saying that surrender which does not pass through genuine emotion is probably not surrender, said Jesus. It is resignation in disguise. Marcus stood very still with this. Resignation and surrender are different, he said slowly. Radically, said Jesus. Resignation says, I can do nothing, so I accept. Surrender says, I could fight, and yet I choose to trust. Pause. In Gethsemane, I had other options. I did not use them. Not because I was resigned, but because there was something larger than my discomfort at stake. Purpose, said Marcus. Love, said Jesus. Purpose without love becomes ideology. Love gives purpose a human smell. Marcus looked at him. You always return to love. Because it is always where the conversation finally arrives, regardless of the path we take, said Jesus. You could seem repetitive, said Marcus, not unkindly. Or love could genuinely be the central answer, said Jesus, and most people simply not believe it because it seems too simple. Marcus considered. There was something true there, the human, and especially philosophical, tendency to distrust simple answers. Complexity seemed deeper. But sometimes the truth was simple and complexity was only the necessary path to get there. The dichotomy of control, said Marcus, returning to the beginning, needs a complement. Which? Not only accept what you cannot control, said Marcus slowly, building the thought as he spoke. But trust what you cannot control to something greater than yourself. Pause. For the Stoics, that something greater would be the Logos. For you, it would be the Father. The form is different. The structure is similar. Similar structure, agreed Jesus. And very different experience. Because of the personalness, said Marcus. Because of the love, said Jesus. Marcus paused. You will always add the love. While it is true, yes. Marcus looked at the fountain for a long moment. There was something he had noticed gradually over the course of the conversation, something he was not yet certain how to articulate fully. When I surrendered what I could not control to the Logos, he said, there was something that remained standing inside me. A sovereignty. An unshakable core that observed everything with equanimity. Pause. And when you surrendered to the Father? There was love, said Jesus. Not sovereignty. Love. Which is much less stable than sovereignty and much more real. Less stable. Love is vulnerable to what happens to the beloved, said Jesus. When Peter denied me 3 times, I felt that. When Judas betrayed me, I felt it. A pause. Stoic sovereignty would have said, this does not affect me. Love said, this affects me, and I remain. Marcus was quiet for some time. That is harder, he said finally. It is, agreed Jesus. But it is more true. Marcus looked at the horizon. Perhaps, he said slowly, Stoic surrender is the best that reason can produce. And the surrender you describe is what happens when reason learns to serve love instead of replacing it. Jesus was quiet with that sentence for a moment. That is a good synthesis, he said finally. For a Stoic, that is high praise, said Marcus, with something close to humor. Jesus inclined his head. For a preacher who spoke in parables, too. Marcus sat for a moment in the quiet that followed. Then he returned to the thing he had said earlier and had not finished. There was a specific year, he said. The 15th year of my reign. Commodus was 17. He paused. I began to see with complete clarity what he was going to become. Not a suspicion. A certainty. The character was already formed, and the character was, he stopped. Not formed for what was ahead of him. And what did you do? Everything I could within the limits of what was right, said Marcus. I placed the best advisors around him. Restricted his worst companions. Tried to create conditions that might shape him differently. He paused. All of it was within the things that depended on me. All of it was Stoic practice. And none of it changed what was coming, said Marcus. I had controlled everything within my control. And what was outside my control arrived anyway, exactly as I feared. Jesus was quiet. The question your story about Gethsemane answers, said Marcus, is one I could not answer with Stoicism. He paused. If you know with certainty that the worst will happen, if you have done everything within your control and still see the catastrophe approaching, what do you do with the knowing? You grieve it, said Jesus. You go to the garden and ask for the cup to be taken. You let the knowing be real. He paused. And then you make the only choice that is still yours, what you carry with you into what is coming. Marcus looked at him. What did you carry? The love, said Jesus. The specific love for specific people who were in the room with me that night. Peter, who would deny me. Judas, who had already decided. John, who would remain. He paused. I did not carry them abstractly. I carried them specifically. Each face. Marcus was quiet for a long time. I could not do that with Commodus, he said. See him specifically, love him specifically, and still know what was coming. The knowledge made the love harder to hold. Yes, said Jesus. That is always the cost of love that is not protected by distance. He paused. But distance also protected you from something else. What? The possibility that the love itself, specific, costly, persistent, might have been one of the things that shaped him, even imperfectly. Even insufficiently. Jesus looked at Marcus directly. Distance is safe. Presence is the only thing that transforms. Marcus was still for a very long moment. I kept distance, he said. I surrendered the things outside my control to the logos. But I kept distance from Commodus because the love hurt too much. A pause. That is not Stoic surrender. That is protection. It is, said Jesus. Not as an accusation. As a witness. Surrender to the Father is different, said Marcus slowly. Because the Father does not let you protect yourself from the ones you love. No, said Jesus. The Father does not offer that comfort. He paused. The Father says, love them anyway. Carry the knowing anyway. Go into the garden anyway. A pause. And trust that something beyond what you can see is also present. Marcus looked at the fountain for a long time. That, he said finally, is harder than anything Epictetus ever asked of me. Reflexo. Reflection. The Stoic dichotomy of control is one of the most powerful tools in practical philosophy, separating what depends on you from what does not and focusing only on the former. But Marcus and Jesus reveal in this conversation that there is a third option between controlling and resigning oneself, trusting. Trust is not intellectual weakness. It is the recognition that reality is larger than your capacity to process it, and that there is something, whether the logos, the personal God, the accumulated wisdom of existence, that deserves your trust even when you cannot fully verify it. Practice, identify something you are trying to control that is clearly outside your control. Right, I entrust this to _____ because I trust that ________. Fill in the blanks honestly. If you cannot fill them in, that is valuable information about where your faith is, or its absence. Chapter 5, Anger and Forgiveness. In your anger do not sin, do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. Ephesians 4 verse 26. Let there be no violence in you. This vice is contrary to the nature of the rational soul. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, 9.3. Marcus Aurelius had written about anger more than almost any other theme in the Meditations. Not because he was naturally irascible, but precisely because he had discovered he was more prone to anger than to any other passion, and that anger was the most destructive of all when uncontrolled. Commodus infuriated me, he said, with an honesty that cost something. My son. The man I had formed, or tried to form, to lead Rome. Who chose a different path. He paused. There were days when the rage I felt toward him was so intense that I needed to leave the palace and walk for hours before I could speak with anyone. What did you do with that anger? Asked Jesus. I analyzed it, said Marcus. It was my method. I would ask, where does this anger come from? The answer was almost always the same, unmet expectations. I expected Commodus to be one type of man. He was another type. The anger was the space between expectation and reality. And once you identified the source. I tried to dissolve the expectation, said Marcus. Epictetus taught that it is not things that disturb men, but the judgments they make about things. Change the judgment, especially the judgments about what other people should be, and the disturbance disappears. Jesus was quiet for a moment. And did it work? Marcus paused honestly. On most days, yes. At the peak of anger, no. He looked at his hands. There is a threshold beyond which reasoning loses access to the anger. When that threshold is crossed, the tool I have cannot reach the problem. What did you do when you crossed that threshold? I waited, said Marcus. Put physical distance when possible. Waited for the intensity to drop. And then reasoned. Jesus nodded. There is wisdom in that. The pause between stimulus and response is where freedom exists. Epictetus had a version of that, said Marcus. But you said 70 times 7. He looked at Jesus. You didn't speak about controlling anger. You spoke about forgiving infinitely. That is different. It is, said Jesus. Forgiving infinitely is impossible without resolving the anger first, said Marcus. Either you forgive without resolving the anger and the forgiveness is just suppression. Or you resolve the anger and forgiveness becomes easier. Jesus considered. There is a third option. Which? Forgiving through the anger, said Jesus. Not by suppressing the anger. Not by waiting for the anger to resolve before forgiving. But choosing to forgive while the anger is still present. Marcus frowned slightly. That sounds contradictory. It seems so, agreed Jesus. But it is how it actually works. Forgiveness is not a feeling. It is a decision. And decisions can be made in the midst of feelings that do not support them. Marcus considered this. There was something there that clashed with his philosophy, the idea that correct action should follow correct judgment, and correct judgment should precede action. The idea of acting against the present emotional state was strange to the Stoic framework. You are saying that forgiveness is an act of will independent of emotional state, said Marcus. I am saying forgiveness begins as an act of will, said Jesus. And that over time, when practiced, it begins to change the emotional state. Pause. But the beginning does not wait for the feelings. Marcus considered. It is not different from what I practiced, he said after a moment. Stoic virtue also begins as an act of will. You choose to act virtuously before you feel virtuous. Over time, character changes. Feelings follow action, not the reverse. Then we have deeper agreement than appears, said Jesus. On one thing, said Marcus. Correct action precedes correct feeling. He paused. But there is a difference in what you are proposing. Stoic forgiveness would be the dissolution of expectation. You expect nothing from the other, so there is nothing to forgive. He looked at Jesus. Your forgiveness is different. My forgiveness acknowledges that there was damage, said Jesus. It does not dissolve the expectation. It says, something wrong happened here, and I choose not to let it define what comes next. That is more complex, said Marcus. It is more human, said Jesus. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Stoics amuse themselves with that argument. What is human is not necessarily what is correct. No, agreed Jesus. But what is human is often what is possible. And philosophies that propose the impossible rarely change very much. Something in that observation stung Marcus more than he wanted to admit. Stoicism had produced wise emperors, philosopher slaves, virtuous generals. But it had also produced, he knew, a superficial version of itself, people who suppressed emotions instead of transforming them, who called philosophy what was merely coldness. When you forgave those who crucified you, said Marcus, were you still angry with them? I don't know if it was anger, said Jesus slowly. It was something more like pain. And also a strange clarity, those people were acting from what they knew and what they feared. Pause. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do was not an assertion that what they were doing was acceptable. It was recognition that ignorance, not pure malice, was at the root. You were analyzing the anger while living it, said Marcus. That is Stoic. I was, said Jesus. But I did not stop at the analysis. The analysis led to forgiveness. Not as an intellectual conclusion, but as a choice. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Commodus, he said finally. I never completely forgave him. There was something in the confession that was not performative regret, but the sobriety of an honest inventory. I resolved my anger toward him, the acute anger passed. But forgiveness, the choice not to let what he did define what comes next, was never complete. Why? Asked Jesus, without judgment. Because what he did continued to have consequences, said Marcus. It did not die with me. Continued to destroy what I had tried to build. A pause. How do you forgive something that is still happening? It was an honest question. And difficult. Jesus was quiet for some time before answering. You forgive the agent, he said. Not necessarily the consequences. And sometimes that is all that is possible. Pause. There are people who did things whose consequences lasted generations. Forgiving those people does not make the consequences disappear. He looked at Marcus. But holding on to the bitterness does not make the consequences disappear either. It only adds weight to you. Marcus nodded slowly. There was something in that sentence he recognized viscerally, not from philosophy, but from the experience of the years on the Danube, when the weight of certain decisions had lasted longer than the decisions themselves. Bitterness is a weight you carry on behalf of the past, said Marcus, building the thought. And the past will not thank you for it. It will not, said Jesus. The only one who pays the weight of bitterness is the one who carries it. So forgiveness is enlightened self-interest, said Marcus. Partially, said Jesus. But only partially. Because if it were only self-interest, you would forgive only when it was convenient for you. Real forgiveness goes beyond that. Where does it go? Toward the good of the other, said Jesus. Not because the other deserves it, but because you refuse to let what they did determine who you are. Marcus was quiet for some time. The fountain murmured beside them. You said that forgiving is a choice, not a feeling, said Marcus finally. But what to do when the choice is made and the feeling does not change? Keep choosing, said Jesus. 70 times 7 was not poetic exaggeration. It was practical instruction. Forgiveness may need to be chosen many times for the same thing before the feeling begins to accompany the decision. Repetition as practice, said Marcus. That is Stoic. It is human, said Jesus. And in this case, both things are the same. Marcus looked at Jesus for a long moment. There was something he needed to say, something he had been carrying throughout the conversation about anger without placing it directly on the table. There is an anger I never resolved completely, he said. And it was not with Commodus. It was with myself. Jesus waited. For not having been the father I should have been, said Marcus. For having spent more time caring for an abstract empire than for a concrete son. A long pause. Anger at oneself is different. It has no external object to analyze. It is a closed circuit. Jesus looked at him with something that was not pity, but proximity. Have you forgiven yourself? Marcus was quiet for a time that lasted longer than any other silence between them. Not completely, he said. Then begin there, said Jesus. The forgiveness you cannot give to others is often stuck in a forgiveness you cannot give to yourself. Marcus was quiet for a time that was not comfortable and not uncomfortable, simply real. What would that look like? He asked. It was not a philosophical question. It was a practical one. The question of a man who had just acknowledged a specific wound and was not willing to leave it unexamined. Jesus leaned forward slightly. What is the specific thing you cannot forgive yourself for? Not in general. Specifically. Marcus considered. The specific thing, he said slowly, is not a dramatic failure. It is not a wrong decision or a political error. He paused. It is this, that I spent 40 years writing about how to be present, how to care for what is immediately before you, how to see the face of the person in the room. And with my own son, the person closest to me, I looked past him toward the empire. He paused. I saw Rome's future more clearly than I saw him. The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight. How old was he when this became the pattern? Asked Jesus. Young, said Marcus. Perhaps 6. Perhaps 7. He would come to where I was writing and stand at the door. And I would see him in my peripheral vision, and I would think, in a moment, I will invite him in. He paused. And the moment would pass. And then another. A very long pause. He stopped coming to the door before I noticed how many times I had not looked up. Jesus said nothing for a time. When he spoke, it was quietly. Do you remember a moment when you did look up? Marcus thought. Yes, he said. Once, when he was perhaps 8. He had fallen from a horse. Not badly, nothing broken. But he was frightened. He paused. I left the correspondence on the desk and went to him. Stayed with him the whole afternoon. And he fell asleep in my presence, and I sat beside him while he slept, and I thought, this is what a father is. You knew, said Jesus. I knew, said Marcus. And still, the next morning, there was Rome. Marcus, said Jesus, and the use of his name directly was rare enough to arrest the attention, you are describing a man who understood what mattered and could not consistently give it what it required. He paused. That is not a unique failure. It is the most common failure available to people who care about large things. That does not console me. I am not trying to console you, said Jesus. I am trying to locate the failure precisely. He paused. The failure was not that you were a bad man. It was that you were a good man who allowed a very important thing to be repeatedly displaced by other important things. A pause. The question is, can a man who genuinely sees that displacement, who genuinely grieves it, who would choose differently if he could, can that man begin to extend to himself the same recognition he would extend to another in the same position? Marcus was very still. What would I say to another man who described what I described? He said slowly. What would you say? Asked Jesus. Marcus thought carefully. That regret without self-condemnation is the proper response. That the awareness of the failure is itself a form of respect paid to what was neglected. That a man who can see clearly what he did wrong is not the same man who did it. Then say that to yourself, said Jesus. Not because it removes the weight. It does not. He paused. But because continuing to punish yourself for what you cannot change is not justice. It is a form of egotism, as though your suffering were a payment that balances the account. Marcus looked at him sharply. Egotism. Self-punishment can be a way of remaining at the center of the story, said Jesus. Of making your guilt the most important thing in the room. He paused. The alternative is harder, to name the failure, to grieve it honestly, and then to release your own face from the center of the image. He paused. Not because the failure doesn't matter. Because other people matter more than your punishment. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Something moved in him, not resolution, but the beginning of a different relationship to an old weight. The forgiveness I cannot give myself, he said at last, is stuck in the belief that not forgiving is somehow more respectful to what I failed. More respectful to your image of what a serious man owes his failures, said Jesus. Not to the failure itself. He paused. Commodus did not need your guilt. He needed your presence. And presence, even now, even in memory, requires that you stop being condemned in your own court. Marcus looked at the fountain. The water moved without holding what had passed through it. Reflexo. Reflection. Anger is perhaps the emotion most studied by Marcus Aurelius, and most confronted by Jesus. One proposes dissolving the expectation that generates anger, the other proposes forgiveness that moves through anger without waiting for it to disappear first. Both arrive at a shared point: uncontrolled anger does not harm its object, it harms the one who carries it. And the path beyond it requires an active choice, not passive waiting for the feeling to change on its own. Practice: think of someone, or yourself, toward whom you hold bitterness. Write, I choose to forgive ____________. Not because what they did was right, but because I refuse to let it continue to define me. Don't wait to feel the forgiveness before writing it. Write first. The feeling may come later, or it may not come so soon. But the choice can be made now. Chapter 6, The Emperor and the Servant. But among you it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be the slave of everyone else. Mark 10 verses 43-44. Think often of how fast all things and beings pass and perish. For substance is like a river in perpetual flux, actions are in perpetual change, and causes work through infinite permutations. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, 4.3. The subject of power came naturally, because they were sitting, inevitably, between two poles that could not have been more opposite. One had commanded the largest empire in the Western world. He had made decisions that affected millions of people before breakfast. He had signed execution orders, allocated armies, negotiated peace treaties with barbarian kings. Power, for Marcus Aurelius, was not an aspiration, it was a daily burden he bore with studied sobriety. The other had owned nothing. Had commanded no one. Had never raised an army, never governed a city, never accumulated political influence. And yet, Marcus recognized this with an honesty that was one of his most valuable characteristics: Jesus had changed the world more permanently than any military campaign Marcus had waged. How is that possible? Asked Marcus. He was genuinely curious, not rhetorical. Jesus looked at him without false modesty. Because power that serves creates, power that dominates destroys. A pause. You can conquer a territory. You cannot conquer a heart. I did not try to conquer hearts, said Marcus. I tried to govern justly. It is different. Is it? Said Jesus. Marcus considered. Just governance does not need hearts. It needs compliance. People who follow the laws not because they love the emperor, but because the laws are reasonable and the enforcement is consistent. And that produces a functioning empire, said Jesus. But not a transformed society. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I did not have as a goal a transformed society. My goal was a well-functioning society. There is a difference. There is, agreed Jesus. And it is a significant difference in ambition. He paused. But which produces something that lasts longer? Marcus knew the answer. Rome had fallen. The institutions he had maintained, the Senate, the legions, the law, had lasted some generations after his death and then collapsed under pressures older than any philosopher. The texts he had written, private notes not intended for publication, had survived 2 millennia. And the movement Jesus had set in motion had done something no empire had achieved. It had spread without armies, survived without governments, and continued changing people one by one from the inside. You chose a different form of power, said Marcus slowly. Not coercive power. Something else. The only true power, said Jesus. The power to transform how people see themselves and the world. Marcus stood. He was thinking. But that power is slower, he said. If I wanted to stop a war, I needed an army. If I wanted to build a road, I needed engineers and workers. He turned to Jesus. What you describe is powerful in the long run, but in the short run, coercive power moves things faster. Yes, said Jesus. And that is why rulers like you are necessary. He paused. I never said that governing was wrong. I said that domination, using power for one's own benefit at the expense of others, was wrong. A just governor who serves his people exercises a completely legitimate form of power. Marcus nodded. Then where is the divergence between us? Jesus thought for a moment. In what you considered a success. Marcus waited. You considered it a success to keep the empire stable, the borders protected, the laws functioning. That is success at managing complexity. Jesus paused. I considered it a success when someone who believed they were outside love discovered they were inside it. A pause. These are completely different metrics. Marcus considered. And none is sufficient alone, he said slowly. A society of people who are individually loved and internally transformed still needs roads, laws, courts, armies. He paused. And an empire of roads, laws, courts, and armies inhabited by people who are internally empty does not hold. Rome, said Jesus simply. Rome, agreed Marcus. It was not a comfortable observation for either of them. Rome, that extraordinary human achievement, had failed precisely where it was weakest, in the interior of its people. The exterior machinery, the engineering, the law, the military organization, had been extraordinary. The interior, the sense of meaning, the capacity for sacrifice beyond personal interest, the willingness to serve a purpose larger than oneself, had eroded slowly and then quickly. You said something about servant leadership, said Marcus. Among you, whoever wants to be great must be your servant. That contradicts everything my culture taught about power. Contradicts the surface form, said Jesus. The idea is that the true function of leadership is serving those led, not using those led to serve the leader. A pause. A father who cares for his children is not diminished by the care. He becomes more of what a father should be. Stoicism agrees with that, said Marcus. The emperor exists for the empire, not the reverse. I wrote this explicitly in the Meditations, I am an emperor who serves, not one who rules. He paused. The distinction in practice is difficult to maintain. Extremely difficult, said Jesus. And you? Said Marcus. You led 12 men for 3 years. Small group. Short time. He paused. But even so, there were moments of friction. Who would be greatest? Who would sit at your right hand? Yes, said Jesus, with something close to a tired smile. Constantly. And what did you do? Washed their feet, said Jesus. Marcus was quiet with this. That is shocking, he said. For someone of your, he hesitated over the word, your authority. That was exactly why I did it, said Jesus. The lesson could not be taught in words. It needed to be embodied in a gesture. A pause. When the teacher washes the student's feet, the hierarchy is inverted in a way that cannot be unseen. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He had never washed a soldier's feet. He had gone out to walk among them, that was a form of presence that many emperors refused. But feet washing, that was something else. That was removing the symbolic distance between emperor and soldier at the most basic level. I do not think I could have done that, said Marcus. Not because of arrogance, but because the distance of the emperor from his soldiers is also a source of authority. Remove it entirely and you remove a tool of governance. There is wisdom in that, said Jesus. But also a limit. He leaned forward. Marcus, when you were among your soldiers walking through the camp during the plague, what happened? Marcus remembered. They were different. Calmer. The morale improved noticeably. Why? Because the emperor was among them. Sharing the risk. Not hidden in the palace. He paused. The presence itself was the communication. The presence was the message, said Jesus. That is the same principle as washing feet. You crossed a distance. Not all of it. But enough for the message to be received, you matter enough for me to be here with you. Marcus looked at him. The difference of degree, then, not kind. In the essential sense, yes, said Jesus. The question is always, does your power serve those below you or those above you? A pause. You serve those below you, within the limits of your context. That is not a small thing. But it was not enough, said Marcus. What is ever enough? Said Jesus. The question is not whether it was sufficient. The question is whether it was faithful to the best understanding of what the situation required. Marcus considered this for a moment. The Stoic in him wanted a more precise standard. But there was something in what Jesus said that was more honest than precision, that fidelity, doing the best you understand at the time you understand it, is all anyone can truly offer. Power corrupts most who hold it, said Marcus. I have seen this so many times I lost count. Men of principle who discovered that principle was flexible when enough pressure was applied. He paused. How does one resist this? By constantly remembering that you are accountable to something greater than the power you hold, said Jesus. The Logos, said Marcus. I held myself accountable to cosmic reason. I held myself accountable to the Father, said Jesus. Again, similar structure, very different experience. He paused. The Logos does not notice if you fail. The Father notices. A longer pause. That noticing makes a difference in the moment of temptation. Marcus thought about this. You are describing accountability to a personal witness. More than witness, said Jesus. To someone who knows why you are tempted, understands the pressure, and still expects better. A pause. That is simultaneously more demanding and more sustaining than accountability to an abstraction. Marcus nodded slowly. He had always held himself to a high standard, not because someone external was watching, but because his own rational faculty demanded it. But he admitted, carefully, that there were moments when the rational faculty itself could be persuaded to rationalize. The external witness, even if only internal, in the form of a god or a father, might be harder to fool than one's own reasoning. The emperor who answers to God, said Marcus. Christian emperors tried that. It did not always work well. No, agreed Jesus. Because they confused answering to God with acting in God's name. He looked at Marcus. The first produces humility. The second produces justification for anything. Marcus looked at him. That is a very precise distinction. Power needs very precise distinctions, said Jesus. Imprecision in the powerful produces catastrophe. They were quiet for a moment. The fountain continued its murmur. The fig tree stretched its shade unhurried. There was a specific moment, said Marcus, when power offered me something I wanted very badly. He paused. Avidius Cassius. You may not know the name. He was one of my finest generals. In the year 175, a false rumor spread through the East that I had died. Cassius declared himself emperor. He paused. When I heard, my first response was not anger. It was relief. Jesus looked at him. Relief? Relief that perhaps the burden was over, said Marcus. That someone else had stepped forward and I could lay it down. He paused. I did not want to fight Cassius. I wrote to him offering a peaceful resolution. I was prepared to pardon him publicly and retire from the throne. What happened? His own men killed him before I could, said Marcus. Sent me his head. Which I refused to look at. He paused. And then I was emperor again. Jesus was quiet for a moment. And you never had the choice. The choice was made for me, said Marcus. Which was perhaps better. Because the choice I would have made, to lay down the power, was not in the interest of the people who depended on the stability of Rome. He paused. Power I did not want, that I would have surrendered, that I was forced to retain. A longer pause. That is perhaps the only kind of power that can be held for long without corruption. Power held reluctantly, said Jesus. Power held as a duty rather than an achievement, said Marcus. When you see power as something you earned, you use it to protect the self that earned it. When you see it as something given, even imposed, you use it for the purpose it was given for. Jesus nodded slowly. Pilate had power given to him by Rome, he said. He did not choose it badly. He chose it fearfully. He paused. He knew I was innocent. The text makes this clear, he found no fault in me. 3 times he said it. A pause. But he feared the crowd more than he honored the truth. And the power he held became the instrument of the injustice he knew was unjust. Power and fear, said Marcus. The combination that destroys every governor eventually. Power without accountability produces fear, said Jesus. Because the only thing that keeps unaccountable power from being used against you is the will of the one who holds it. And will is changeable. He paused. Pilate was an intelligent man in an impossible position. His masters in Rome expected peace. The crowd demanded a death. The prisoner was innocent. A pause. He chose the choice that preserved his position rather than the one that honored his own judgment. I made choices that cost me position, said Marcus. Refused to elevate favorites who expected elevation. Declined bribes from senators who expected gratitude. He paused. Each of those choices reduced my room to maneuver. But the alternative was becoming someone whose judgment could be purchased. And you feared becoming Pilate, said Jesus. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I feared becoming Nero, he said. Who was also, by all accounts, an intelligent man in the beginning. He paused. Power without character does not merely fail to do good. It actively destroys. Which is why character matters more than power, said Jesus. And why the emperor who spends more time on his own character than on his power is doing the more important work. Were you afraid of power? Asked Marcus. Jesus was quiet for a moment. Of what power does to people, yes, he said. The moment of temptation in the desert was largely about power. The capacity to dominate kingdoms, to demonstrate force. Pause. It was a real temptation. Not a performance. And how did you refuse it? By remembering that the kind of world worth building is not built by domination, said Jesus. That any gain made through force is temporary and requires continuous force to maintain. A pause. The world worth building is built one willing heart at a time. And that is painfully slow. But it is the only kind that holds. Marcus looked at his own hands, hands that had held much power and released it in death. And looked at Jesus, who had chosen to never lift them for anything that could be called domination. Two very different lives, he said. One outcome, said Jesus. 2,000 years of conversation about how to live well. He paused. Perhaps that says something about which form of power endures. Reflexo. Reflection. Power is a lens that reveals character. Marcus Aurelius chose to use it in service, Jesus chose to demonstrate it through servanthood itself. Both left records that outlasted the empires and institutions of their time. The question power poses to anyone who holds it, small or large, is always the same: does this position serve you or those you lead? And beneath that question is another: to what, or to whom, are you ultimately accountable? Practice. Think of an area where you hold authority, a team, a family, a role. Ask yourself honestly, do I use this authority to serve those below me or to serve my own position? Write one concrete thing you could do this week that would look more like the teacher washing feet. Chapter 7, The Logos and the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, without him nothing was made that has been made. John 1 verses 1-3. Constantly look at the whole, the nature of things and your own nature, and what relation the two bear. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, X.9. This was the conversation Marcus Aurelius had waited for. Not with impatience, Stoics do not wait with impatience. But with the sustained attention of a man who has circled around a central idea for years, knowing that at some point he will finally arrive at it directly. The Logos. For the Stoics, the Logos was the rational principle that structured and governed the cosmos. Not a god in the anthropomorphic sense, a force, an intelligence, an order immanent in reality itself. The fire that burns without consuming. The reason that explains why things are the way they are rather than some other way. The principle Marcus Aurelius had spent his life trying to align himself with. And across from him sat someone whose followers used the same word, logos, to describe him. John wrote that you were the logos in the beginning, said Marcus. That all things were made through you. He looked at Jesus carefully. That is an extraordinary claim. Yes, said Jesus. Without inflation or false modesty. Simply, yes. The Stoic logos is impersonal, said Marcus. It is reason. Structure. The underlying order. It does not choose. It does not love. It does not become flesh. He paused. You became flesh. Yes. Then either John used the word imprecisely, borrowing a term he knew would resonate with Greek readers, Marcus paused, or what you call logos is fundamentally different from what I call logos. Perhaps both, said Jesus. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Explain. Jesus was quiet for a moment, organizing the thought with unusual care. What the Stoics call logos, he said, is the rational structure of everything that exists. The reason why a seed becomes a tree and not a stone. The reason why fire burns upward and water flows downward. The reason why your meditations make sense to someone who never met you, because reason is universal. A pause. I do not disagree with that. But that structure is not neutral, said Jesus. It has a direction. And the direction is love. Marcus frowned. Love is not a philosophical category. It is an emotion. In human language, yes, said Jesus. But what I describe is prior to human language. What I describe is the reason why, when you study reality deeply enough, you consistently find that things which cooperate survive longer than things that compete destructively. A pause. That healing is more fundamental than destruction. That creation is more native to the cosmos than annihilation. Marcus considered. You are describing a value embedded in the structure of reality. Embedded in the structure of the logos, said Jesus. Which Stoics discovered as reason, real, but incomplete. Reason is the form the logos takes when the universe thinks. Love is what the logos is when it chooses. You are saying the logos chooses, said Marcus. I am saying I chose, said Jesus. And I was the logos made flesh. Marcus was very still for a moment. The claim was so enormous it needed to be examined from all sides. That is either the deepest truth or the greatest presumption I have ever heard, he said. I know, said Jesus. Marcus stood. He needed to think with his whole body. The logos becoming flesh implies that the rational structure of the cosmos desired something, he said while walking. That the impersonal became personal. That the abstract took on a specific face, a name, a history. He stopped. For a Stoic, that is strange. The logos is not the kind of thing that has desires. And yet, said Jesus, you spent your entire life trying to align yourself with the logos. To think as the logos thinks. To act as the logos would act. He paused. What does it mean to align yourself with something? Marcus considered. It means to orient yourself in the same direction. To move according to its principles. And if the logos had a direction, said Jesus, would you not want to know what it was? Marcus was quiet for a long time. It was a question that sat under many of his other questions. The logos, for the Stoics, had a direction, he said. Toward the good. Toward flourishing. Toward the natural completion of things. Yes, agreed Jesus. And I am saying that at the center of that direction is what you call love, but which is prior to the word love. It is the force that makes communion preferable to isolation, that makes giving more native than taking, that makes healing more fundamental than destruction. Marcus returned to his stone. You are proposing that the impersonal reason of the universe, the logos, when traced to its origin, reveals a kind of will toward the flourishing of what it created. Yes, said Jesus. And that will is what I call Father. Marcus looked at him. The logos as Father. The logos as the one who desires, said Jesus. Who desired the existence of the cosmos? Who desires that creation flourish? Who desired, at a specific moment in history, to become present in the most human way possible, with flesh, with hunger, with friendship, with suffering? The Incarnation, said Marcus. That word was not yet used in your time, but it became the center of later Christian thought. The center, yes, said Jesus. Because it said something that nothing else had said, the rational principle of the cosmos is not indifferent to you. It chose to become like you. Marcus looked at the fountain for a long moment. There was something in that sentence that moved something in him, and that movement unsettled him slightly. You are saying the logos cares for specific individuals, he said. I am saying the logos knows specific individuals, said Jesus. The hairs of your head. The worries of your night. The question you do not ask aloud because you are afraid the answer will change too much. Marcus looked at him. That question. Yes, said Jesus. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly. The question I never asked aloud in all my years of philosophy is, does the logos see me, specifically? Or does it only see the pattern I am part of? He paused. Because if it only sees the pattern, then I am replaceable. An instance of reason, useful while I function and discarded when I stop. And if it sees you specifically? Then I am not replaceable, said Marcus. And that changes everything about the meaning of this. He gestured to his own existence, my specific existence. Jesus was quiet with this for a moment. When he spoke, it was carefully. The logos that is impersonal reason does not see you, he said. The logos that chose to have a face, a name, a history, that one sees you. A pause. The question of which is more true is, in the end, the deepest philosophical question there is. And you believe the second, said Marcus. I don't believe the second, said Jesus. I am the second. Marcus was silent for a long time. The claim was still enormous. And yet, he turned it over carefully, there was an internal coherence to it that resisted easy dismissal. If the rational principle of the cosmos genuinely was oriented toward the flourishing of what it created, then the choice to become specific and personal was not irrational. It was the logical conclusion of a love that had always been there, made visible. The Word, said Marcus slowly, in the beginning. Before words existed, there was this principle. This direction. This desire. And the principle became a word, said Jesus. And the word became flesh. And the flesh became specific, vulnerable, located in a specific time and place and culture. He paused. Not because specificity diminished the universal. But because the universal, to truly reach the particular, needed to become particular itself. Marcus considered this. The problem of the universal and the particular, he said. Plato's problem. How does the form connect with the instance? A pause. You are proposing the connection happened through choice. The form chose to become an instance. And thereby connected every instance with the form, said Jesus. Which was the point? Marcus stood again. This time he walked to the fountain and looked at the water. I have spent decades trying to elevate myself to the level of reason, he said. The Stoic path is ascent. Reasoning better, controlling impulses better, aligning more perfectly with the logos. He turned. You are proposing the opposite movement happened. The meeting point was moved to where the particular is, said Jesus. Not because the universal descended to a lesser level. But because the universal, being what it is, chose proximity rather than distance. Marcus was quiet for a very long time. Something was moving in him that resisted easy naming. If that is true, he said at last, then all of my ascent toward the logos was met. All of it, said Jesus. Every genuine step of yours toward reason, toward virtue, toward the good, you were not moving alone. Something was moving toward you. Marcus looked at the fountain. The water murmured unchanged. I do not know if I can believe that, he said honestly. I know, said Jesus. That is why I am not asking you to believe it right now. I am asking you to consider whether it is coherent. Whether it fits what you have already experienced. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. There were moments, he said finally, moments in the meditations, moments on the Danube, moments when I had done everything wrong and was still trying to do what was right, when something was present that I could not explain with the category of reason. A pause. I wrote that off as emotion. As brain chemistry. As the consequence of a trained mind producing clarity under pressure. What if it was recognition? Said Jesus. The logos recognizing someone who was genuinely seeking it. Marcus did not answer. But he did not dismiss the possibility, either. The word that was with God in the beginning murmured alongside him. And the man who had spent his life aligned with the logos sat still in the place where time did not press, and for the first time considered that perhaps the logos had also spent its life aligned with him. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he said something he had not planned to say. There is a passage in my book 6, he said slowly. I wrote, what else do you want? To live forever. Well then, go to sleep. What else? To be praised always. Well, be praised or not. What will you achieve by being praised? Go to sleep. He paused. I wrote that as a reminder against vanity. But there were times when I read it back to myself and thought, who am I speaking to? Jesus looked at him carefully. Because the instruction, said Marcus, feels addressed. Not merely noted. As though the writing were a dialogue rather than a monologue. He paused. I told myself it was the rational faculty addressing the irrational. Reason correcting impulse. But the quality of the exchange was sometimes more reciprocal than that. As though something were responding, said Jesus. As though something were already present when I arrived at the writing, said Marcus. Not a voice. Not a vision. But a quality of, he searched for the word, readiness. As though the clarity I sought were not produced by my seeking but revealed by it. Jesus was quiet for a moment. In Hebrew, he said, the word for wisdom is chokmah. In the Proverbs, wisdom is personified. She calls from the street corners. She sets a table. She was present at the creation, playing before the Father. He paused. The writers of the Proverbs were not writing metaphor. They were describing an encounter. Something that met them when they sought it. Marcus looked at him. You are saying the Logos has always been active in both our traditions. Not only in Greek philosophy. Not only in Hebrew wisdom. He paused. And that when I wrote in Solitude and felt something responding, I was not projecting. I was perceiving something genuinely other. I am saying that is a serious possibility, said Jesus. One that is consistent with what I know. If that is true, said Marcus slowly, then the meditations are not a monologue. They are half a conversation. He paused. The other half was being spoken to me through the clarity itself. Jesus was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was carefully. There are philosophers who spent their lives seeking the Logos, he said, and arrived at a kind of intellectual certainty about it. A correct map. He paused. And there are people who spent their lives less systematically, less philosophically, but who were so genuinely open to what is true that something found them in unexpected places. A pause. The quality of your seeking, Marcus, the honesty of it, the willingness to correct yourself, the refusal to protect your own positions at the expense of what was more true, that quality is the condition the Logos moves toward. You are saying the quality of the seeking determines whether the Logos, whether the word, can be found, said Marcus. I am saying it determines whether you are recognizable, said Jesus. The Logos moves toward what is genuinely open. What is genuinely seeking? He paused. And in what I know of you, from these conversations, from what you wrote, you were genuinely open. More than you knew. He paused. Which may be why there were moments in the writing when something was already there. Marcus stood and walked to the edge of the square. He looked at the horizon, still, bright, unhurried. If that is true, he said, then I lived my whole life in a conversation I only half knew I was having. Most people do, said Jesus. And the half I did not know, said Marcus, was not a void. It was, a presence. Yes, said Jesus. Marcus stood at the edge of the square for a long time. The horizon did not change. The light did not press. When he returned to his stone, something in the way he sat was different. Not dramatically. But in the way a question changes when you stop treating it as a question you must resolve and begin treating it as one that might resolve you. Reflexo. Reflection. The Logos of the Stoics and the word of John's Gospel share the same name and point to something profoundly similar, a rational principle that underlies all of existence. The difference, and it is enormous, is whether that principle is personal or impersonal, whether it is indifferent to specific individuals or knows them by name. This is not a difference that philosophy alone can resolve. It is a question that sits at the border between reason and faith, and demands that each person answer it from the inside. Practice, sit quietly for 10 minutes. Without trying to resolve the theological question, ask yourself only this: in the moments when you were most genuinely trying to live well, most aligned with reason, most honest, most generous, did you feel alone in that effort? What answer rises from below the rational? Whatever it is, take it seriously. Chapter 8, The Present and the Kingdom. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Matthew 6 verses 33 to 34. Confine yourself to the present. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, 8.7. There was a morning on the Danube, Marcus said, when he woke before dawn and stood at the edge of the camp in the cold silence before the army stirred, and looked at the river flowing dark in the grey light, and felt, for one brief moment, something he could not explain to anyone without sounding like he had lost his mind. Peace. Not the absence of threat, the threat was very present. Not the resolution of problems, the problems were many. But a sudden, complete, inexplicable peace. As if everything that needed to be the way it was the way it was. As if the present moment were sufficient. It lasted perhaps a minute, said Marcus. And then the army began to wake, and there were decisions to make, and the peace dissolved like fog in morning light. But I still remember it. Jesus listened with complete attention. Did you know what it was? He asked. I did not, said Marcus. I analyzed it later. The Stoic explanation would be that I had, in that moment, achieved perfect alignment with the present, freed myself from regret about the past and anxiety about the future, and simply was where I was. A pause. But the quality of the experience did not feel like an intellectual achievement. It felt like a gift. Perhaps it was both, said Jesus. Marcus looked at him. You speak of the kingdom of God as though it is present, not future. The kingdom is at hand, you said. The kingdom is among you. Yes. What does that mean? Asked Marcus. Most of your followers seem to interpret it as a future state. A coming reign. The end of history. There is that dimension, said Jesus. But it is not only that. He paused. The kingdom is present wherever the conditions of the kingdom exist: justice, mercy, truth spoken in love, the poor cared for, the broken restored. A pause. What you felt on the Danube that morning, that completeness, was a moment of the kingdom. Marcus was quiet with this. A moment of the kingdom on a cold military camp on the frontier of barbarian territory. Yes, said Jesus. The kingdom does not require a palace. It requires presence. Presence, said Marcus. That is the word that recurs. Because it is the essential thing, said Jesus. Both your Stoicism and what I teach are, in their deepest core, practices of presence. He paused. Your meditatio mortis is a practice of presence, remember death in order to be fully here. My instruction not to worry about tomorrow is a practice of presence, be here in order to receive what here contains. Marcus considered. But there is a difference in what we are present to. Yes, said Jesus. You are present to the rational structure of the moment. To the logos as it manifests here, now, in this specific situation. He paused. I am present to the kingdom, which is the logos made relational. Made alive. Made capable of transforming the moment rather than merely understanding it. Marcus was quiet. The kingdom transforms the moment. Transforms whoever enters the moment with the right quality of attention, said Jesus. Which is presence not as a technique, but as an opening. An opening to what? To what is already here but cannot be seen without the right quality of attention, said Jesus. Grace is always present. Love is always present. The kingdom is always available. Pause. Most people cannot access it because their attention is either in the past or the future. And the kingdom only exists in the present. Marcus stood. But the future requires preparation, he said. A general who does not plan for tomorrow's battle loses the battle. A general who plans for tomorrow's battle, said Jesus, needs to plan with a clear mind. And a clear mind requires presence today. He paused. Anxiety about the future is not planning. It is rumination. And rumination is the opposite of presence. Marcus considered. There is a Stoic distinction between worry and prudent foresight, he said. Prudent foresight considers the future with rational clarity and prepares appropriately. Worry is an emotional agitation that neither prepares effectively nor releases when not needed. Exactly, said Jesus. And the kingdom enables prudent foresight by eliminating the anxious base from which most planning comes. Marcus sat again. The kingdom as a quality of mind from which you act in the world, rather than a future state you wait for. Both, said Jesus. But the both only becomes available when you discover the present dimension first. Most people miss the present kingdom waiting for the future one. And the future one, when it comes, will be continuous with the present one, not separate from it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. There is something in my Stoicism that prepares for the future by removing attachment to it, he said. I try not to desire a specific future, so that whatever comes, I am ready for it. Pause. Is that the same as trusting the kingdom? Similar structure, said Jesus. Different root. You remove attachment because attachment to outcomes distracts from the present. He paused. I seek the kingdom because the kingdom is what makes the present genuinely inhabitable. A pause. Your practice produces equanimity. Mine produces joy. Marcus considered. Equanimity and joy are different. Very different, agreed Jesus. Equanimity is stable but quiet. Joy is contagious. It moves outward. Pause. The kingdom that erupts in the present moment is not quiet. It changes the room. Marcus looked at him. What does that look like in practice? It looks like the woman who sweeps the whole house looking for the lost coin, said Jesus. When she finds it, she calls the neighbors. Not because she needs the neighbors to validate the finding. But because joy, when it is real, overflows the individual who has it. And when you healed someone, said Marcus, was that an eruption of the kingdom? Yes, said Jesus. Not a magical intervention breaking the rules of the cosmos. The rules of the cosmos, at the deepest level, tend toward healing, toward wholeness, toward restoration. Pause. When someone is healed, something is returned to what it should have been. The kingdom is the condition of as it should be. Sometimes it bursts through into as it is. Marcus looked at the fountain. The water flowing consistently, unhurried, always renewing itself. The present, he said slowly, as a doorway. To what has always been here, said Jesus. Under the anxiety. Under the planning. Under the regret. Under the noise of the mind. He paused. That moment on the Danube was not produced by you. You did not achieve it. You received it. For 1 minute, you stopped the noise long enough to notice what had always been there. Marcus was very quiet. It was the sentence that most disturbed his Stoic framework: you did not achieve it, you received it. Stoicism, at its best, was a discipline of achievement. Of the practiced will shaping the character. Of reason gaining sovereignty over impulse. The idea of something that could not be achieved but only received was philosophically uncomfortable. How does one receive it? Asked Marcus. By stopping the effort to achieve it, said Jesus. Marcus looked at him. That is a paradox. It is a truth that looks like a paradox from inside the framework of achievement, said Jesus. From inside the framework of the kingdom, it is simply how presence works. You cannot try to be present. You can only remove the obstacles to presence, the anxiety, the attachment, the need to control, and then what has always been here becomes visible. Marcus was quiet for a long time. The fountain murmured. The fig tree stood in its heatless shade. I am not sure I can stop trying, said Marcus. A lifetime of practice has made effort the air I breathe. I know, said Jesus. I am not asking you to stop trying in everything. I am asking whether, in the practice of presence specifically, you have noticed that effort produces the opposite of what you seek. Marcus considered. The morning on the Danube had come when he was not trying. He had simply woken, walked to the river, and stood. No technique. No mental exercise. Just the cold and the dark and the river. And something had been present that all his techniques never quite produced. Perhaps, said Marcus slowly, the kingdom is what remains when the philosopher stops philosophizing. Jesus smiled. And what the philosopher returns to, richer, when he begins again. Marcus sat with this for a moment. Then he described something he had never described to anyone, because there was no one to whom it was appropriate to describe it. There was a battle decision I made in the year 171, he said. The Marcomanni had crossed the Danube with a force larger than our intelligence had anticipated. We were outnumbered. Every tactical analysis I had, every assessment from my generals, pointed toward a defensive withdrawal. Regroup, reinforce, counter in the spring. And I ordered the advance, said Marcus. Not impulsively. I had considered the tactical analysis carefully. But there was something, underneath the analysis, alongside it, a clarity I could not explain in purely strategic terms. Not emotion. More like a certainty that the analysis was missing something the analysis could not see. What was it missing? The moment, said Marcus. The specific quality of that specific day. The condition of the men. The weather. The position of the sun. He paused, the fact that the enemy was also afraid, and that fear in an advancing enemy is more vulnerable than numbers. He paused. None of that was in the analysis. It was available only to someone present enough to feel the texture of the moment rather than only count its elements. The kingdom in a military decision, said Jesus. Marcus looked at him. That is not how I would have described it. And yet, said Jesus, that quality of attention to what the present moment contains that cannot be counted or analyzed, that is what I mean by seeking the kingdom. He paused. Not the specific content. The quality of presence that makes the content visible. Marcus was quiet for a moment. We won the battle, he said. Not easily. But we won it. And I have never been able to explain to anyone exactly why I made that decision, because the explanation is not in the facts. The explanation is in the presence, said Jesus. Which does not translate into analysis, because analysis is what you apply when you are not yet present enough to see what is actually there. Marcus considered this carefully. Then the kingdom, in this sense, is available even to those who do not believe in the kingdom. The kingdom is present regardless of whether anyone believes in it, said Jesus. Belief determines whether you seek it. Presence determines whether you find it. He paused. You found it on the Danube that morning when you stood at the river and the peace arrived. You found it in that battle decision. He paused. You found it in the meditations, many times, when the writing arrived with a quality that surprised you. I found it without a name for it, said Marcus. Many people do, said Jesus. The name helps you seek it intentionally. But the thing is prior to the name. Marcus stood and walked once around the fountain, slowly. He was doing something he did rarely, allowing himself to be surprised by his own life, seen from a new angle. There were more of those moments than I accounted for, he said. Yes, said Jesus. Philosophers often undercount the experiences that don't fit their frameworks. And you? Said Marcus, returning to his stone. What were your moments of kingdom breaking through? Jesus considered. The feeding of the 5,000, he said. 5,000 people, no food, the disciples panicking about logistics. He paused. And there was a boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish. The disciples saw the problem. 5,005 loaves is a catastrophe. I saw the boy. He paused. The kingdom begins in what is available, not in what is sufficient. The boy's willingness to give what he had was the doorway. The rest followed. The presence to see the boy rather than the mathematics, said Marcus. The presence to see what was actually there rather than what the situation theoretically required, said Jesus. That is always how the kingdom works. Not in the provision that arrives from outside the moment. In the gift that was already in the moment, invisible until someone was present enough to see it. Marcus looked at him. That morning on the Danube, he said, when the peace arrived. What was already in the moment that I became present enough to see? Jesus was quiet for a long time. The river, he said. Moving without effort. Present without trying to be present. Offering what it was without asking whether it was enough. He paused. You became, for a minute, like the river. And that was the kingdom opening. Marcus looked at the fountain. The water moved, unhurried, always new, always the same. I want to learn to be like the river more reliably, he said. Then stop trying to be the river, said Jesus. And notice when you already are. Reflexo. Reflection. Confine yourself to the present, Marcus Aurelius, and, do not worry about tomorrow, Jesus, arrive at the same instruction from very different starting points. Both recognize that the present moment is the only place where life actually happens, that past and future are important as context and planning, but the actual living occurs only here, now. The difference, Stoic presence produces equanimity. The kingdom presence Jesus describes produces joy. One is the stable ground of a well-ordered mind. The other is the overflow of a life in contact with something larger than itself. Practice, set a timer for 3 minutes. Sit in complete stillness. Do not try to achieve presence, think constructively, or solve problems. Simply notice what is already here, sounds, sensations, the breath. When the 3 minutes end, note, did anything shift? Something that was already present but unseen. Chapter 9, Virtue and Love. If I have all the gifts of prophecy, and if I understand all the mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. 1 Corinthians 13 verse 2. What could harm you from without if you have not sinned within? What is your true good? The will conform to nature. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, v.19. This was, in many ways, the central conversation. The Stoics spoke of 4 cardinal virtues: wisdom, courage, justice, temperance. Everything else, pleasure, wealth, health, reputation, was classified as preferred indifference, things that were preferable but not genuinely good, things that did not define the quality of a human life. The virtue that made all other virtues possible was wisdom, the correct use of reason to understand what was genuinely good and act accordingly. Jesus spoke of 2 commandments that contained everything: love God with all your being, and love your neighbor as yourself. From these 2, he said, hung all the law and the prophets. The word at the center of Jesus's ethics was not wisdom but love. Marcus had thought about this difference for the length of their conversation. Now he put it directly. Your central category is love, he said. Mine is virtue, and within virtue, wisdom. He paused. Why love rather than wisdom? Wisdom seems more reliable. Love is prone to error, to idealization, to losing itself in the beloved. Because wisdom without love produces very smart cruelty, said Jesus. Marcus was quiet. History is full of wise men who used their wisdom in service of themselves, said Jesus. Brilliant strategists who conquered and subjugated. Astute philosophers who justified slavery. He looked at Marcus. Wisdom is a tool. Tools can be used for construction or destruction. What determines the direction is something deeper than wisdom. Love, said Marcus. What you love, said Jesus. The object of your love determines the direction of your wisdom. A pause. A wise man who loves his own power uses wisdom to extend his power. A wise man who loves truth uses wisdom to find truth. A wise man who loves his neighbors uses wisdom to serve them. Marcus considered. Then love is prior to virtue. Love is the root from which genuine virtue grows, said Jesus. Virtues without love, practiced as exercises, as tools of self-improvement, produce excellent performance and cold character. Marcus was quiet with this. There was something uncomfortable in the formulation, and something uncomfortably true. What makes virtues genuine, then? He asked. The love from which they arise, said Jesus. Courage that arises from love for your neighbor is a different thing from courage as personal achievement. He paused. Justice that arises from genuine care for the wronged is different from justice as rule-following. Another pause. Wisdom that seeks the truth because truth matters, rather than because cleverness is admired, is different in quality. The external form is the same, said Marcus. Often, yes, agreed Jesus. That is why it is easy to confuse them. But the difference becomes visible under pressure. He paused. When doing the right thing has a cost, a real cost, to you, to your comfort, to your power, the love-sourced virtue holds. The performance-based virtue looks for exit. Marcus nodded slowly. He had seen this in his generals. Men of apparent virtue who held their position perfectly while the position was comfortable, and began to look for compromise when the cost rose. Paul wrote about love enduring all things, said Marcus. He was familiar with the text, encountered in letters that had circulated within the empire. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Yes, said Jesus. Because love that has a cost is the only love that matters. He paused. Loving what is easy to love is not a virtue. Loving your enemies, forgiving what hurt you, caring for who was unpleasant to you, that is where virtue becomes real. Marcus considered. Stoicism would say you should act justly toward all humans because all are part of one rational body. It is a logical obligation. It is, agreed Jesus. And logical obligations are very solid. He paused. But they are not very warm. And warmth matters. Warmth, said Marcus. The leper no one touched, said Jesus. The logical obligation would be, care for this person because they are human and deserve care. He paused. What moved me to touch them was not logical obligation. It was that I looked at that person and felt something that could not be resolved by staying at a safe distance. Marcus was quiet. You chose to touch people no one else touched. Because they needed to be touched, said Jesus. Not only healed. Touched. A pause. There is a loneliness in being untouchable that medicine cannot heal. And that impulse to touch, said Marcus, came from love. It came from seeing them, said Jesus. Really seeing. Which is the form love takes when it meets the particular. He paused. You can care abstractly for humanity. You can only love a specific person who is in front of you. Marcus considered. The tension in Stoicism, he said slowly, is exactly that. We are supposed to care for all of humanity as one body. But in practice, you cannot care for a body without a face. He paused. What Stoicism sometimes lost was exactly what you describe, the face of the specific person. The face that commands love, said Jesus. Not the category. Yet without the category, said Marcus, without the idea that all humans deserve equal consideration, you tend only toward those near you. Family. Tribe. Nation. He paused. The universal is necessary to prevent love from becoming mere tribal preference. Necessary but not sufficient, agreed Jesus. The universal opens the circle. But it is the particular face that actually moves you to act. So virtue without love is cold, and love without universal principle is tribal, said Marcus. Each needs the other. To be fully itself, said Jesus. They were quiet for a moment. It was one of those silences that arises when both speakers arrive simultaneously at something they could not quite have said separately. The virtue I practiced, said Marcus, was, in its best moments, love-sourced. When I walked among the soldiers during the plague, I did not go because of philosophical obligation. I went because I could not go. Something pulled me. That something, said Jesus, has a name. Love, said Marcus. Slowly. Not as a concession, but as a recognition. Though I would not have used the word. What word would you have used? Marcus considered. Duty. Conscience. Natural affinity with the human order. A pause. But those are descriptions of the container. Not the content. The content was love, said Jesus. Perhaps unnamed. Perhaps unrecognized. But present. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. There was something that moved in him, not dramatically, but with the quiet intensity of a truth that has been circling for years and finally lands. I wonder, he said, how much of what I thought was Stoic rationality was actually love operating through a rational framework. Probably more than you realized, said Jesus. The framework is real. But frameworks do not usually self-sacrifice. They optimize. He paused. What made you go beyond optimization, toward sacrifice, toward genuine service, toward the soldiers and the poor and the widows and the philosophers you treated better than your rank required? That was not the framework. Marcus looked at his hands again. The same gesture, that returned to the most concrete evidence of a life lived. Then I owe the Stoic framework less than I thought, he said. Or more, said Jesus. The framework gave love a form it could act through. He paused. Form without love is empty. Love without form is ineffective. He looked at Marcus. You found a form. What I am saying is that you also had the love, without fully knowing it. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Paul's famous chapter, said Marcus finally. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. He looked at Jesus. I spoke in the tongues of reason for 40 years. And loved through them, said Jesus. Which is why the Meditations are still read. A pause. Reason without love teaches. Love-sourced reason transforms. Marcus looked at the fountain. The water murmured. The day was unhurried. There is an irony, he said at last. I spent my life certain that reason was sufficient. And you are telling me that what made my reason worth anything was the love I did not fully recognize in it. The irony is real, said Jesus. But it is not diminishing. He looked at Marcus steadily. A man who loves without knowing he loves is still loving. A pause. The knowing comes later. The doing was already there. Marcus was quiet for a time. Then he posed a challenge that had been building throughout the conversation. Consider the comparison, he said, between what happened to Stoic disciples and what happened to your disciples, under extreme pressure. He paused. Cato the Younger, the great Stoic, was defeated by Caesar at Utica. He refused to accept Caesar's clemency, which was genuine, not political. He chose death over a life he considered dishonoring. He paused. Stoicism held in him under the maximum pressure. Jesus listened carefully. But your disciples, said Marcus, your closest disciples, fled on the night of your arrest. Peter denied you 3 times before morning. All of them hid. He paused. The virtue framework seems to have performed better under pressure than the love framework. Jesus was quiet for a moment. You are comparing the final chapter of Cato's story with the worst chapter of Peter's story, he said. I am noting what the maximum test revealed. Then note the sequel, said Jesus. What Cato's Stoicism produced was magnificent death. Correct, principled, philosophically coherent. He paused. What Peter's denial produced was something Stoicism could not have predicted, return. A pause. Peter failed completely. And came back. And became, by most accounts, a man of extraordinary courage, one who ultimately accepted a death more difficult than Cato's, for a different reason. Marcus considered. The failure transformed him. The failure and the return, said Jesus. which required something Stoicism does not provide, a love that does not revoke itself when the loved one fails. He paused. Cato's Stoicism gave him a dignified death. My love gave Peter a second life. A pause. Which of those is more useful to the people around you? Marcus was quiet for some time. The second life, he said. Because, said Jesus, we are surrounded by people who have already failed. Who have already denied what they believed, fled when they should have stayed, chosen the easy thing instead of the right thing. He paused. A philosophy that produces dignified deaths is useful. A love that produces second lives is more urgently needed. Marcus nodded slowly. The Stoic who fails, he said, has nothing to return to except a renewed commitment to the failed virtue. The return is entirely self-generated. He paused. The disciple who fails has something else. Has someone who was there when he failed, said Jesus. And chose not to define him by the failure. He paused. That is the practical difference between virtue as framework and love as ground. The framework tells you what to do. The love tells you who you are, regardless of what you did last. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then love is prior to virtue in the deepest sense, he said finally. Not prior as a historical cause. Prior as the condition that makes virtue resilient rather than merely admirable. Virtue without love can only succeed, said Jesus. Love produces the capacity to fail and continue. Which means it produces people who can be trusted over a long life, not only at the peak. There is an irony, he said at last. I spent my life certain that reason was sufficient. And you are telling me that what made my reason worth anything was the love I did not fully recognize in it. Marcus looked at the fountain again. The water, always new, always the same, not capable of failing to be what it was. Reflexo. Reflection. Virtue and love are not opposites, but they are not the same thing. Virtue without love produces impressive behavior and empty character. Love without virtue produces warm impulses that collapse under pressure. What Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 13 is not love as a feeling, it is love as an orientation of the whole person, the root from which all genuine virtue grows. And what Marcus practiced, those moments of genuine service, presence, sacrifice, was love operating under a rational name. Practice, think of a virtue you practice, courage, honesty, patience, justice. Ask, why do I practice this? If the honest answer is primarily self-improvement, habit, or obligation, notice that. Then ask, is there someone specific whose flourishing this virtue serves? Let that face become more present in your practice this week. Chapter 10, Solitude and Communion. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Luke 5 verse 16. Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, 4.3. Both of them had lived with crowds. Marcus Aurelius had spent decades surrounded by advisors, generals, senators, servants, petitioners. The life of an emperor was a life of constant interruption. Even his philosophy had been written in the margins of chaos, the meditations composed by torchlight in military tents, between campaigns, during the brief intermissions of a perpetually full life. Jesus had traveled through the region with 12 disciples and a larger circle of followers. Had been surrounded by crowds that pressed in to hear, to be healed, to see, to touch. Had barely been able to eat in peace on certain days. Had often hidden in the mountains or on the lake simply to escape the press of people. And yet both had been, in some fundamental way, profoundly alone. The solitude I sought, said Marcus, was interior. I could not leave the palace. I could not leave the army. But I could find, within the noise, a still center. He paused. The Meditations describe that center. A place within the self where reason governs and the external world can be observed without being absorbed. I sought it outwardly too, said Jesus. I needed the mountains. The desert. The places without people. Not because people were a burden, I loved the people. But because there were things I could only hear in silence. What things? Asked Marcus. Jesus was quiet for a moment. The Father's voice, he said. Which is not a voice in the literal sense. It is more like a clarity that comes when the noise settles. When I had been too long among the crowds, the urgencies, the healings, the arguments, something important grew faint. He paused. And in the silence of the mountain it returned. Marcus considered. What you call the Father's voice, I might call the Logos becoming audible, said Marcus. When the noise of the external world settles, the rational structure of things becomes more perceptible. Perhaps they are the same thing in different languages, said Jesus. And perhaps they are different things that have the same dwelling place. Marcus considered. Both are interior. But my solitude was more specifically relational, said Jesus. I did not go to the mountain to achieve philosophical clarity. I went to be with someone. He paused. Stoic interior retreat is the self returning to itself. My retreat was the self returning to the Father. What is the difference in practice? Asked Marcus. The difference is what you bring back, said Jesus. Interior retreat produces equanimity, a more stable, clear, rational self. He paused. Relational retreat produces not only clarity but direction. Not only stability but purpose renewed. Marcus considered. You came back from prayer with specific clarity about what to do next. Frequently, said Jesus. Not always in explicit detail. But with a renewed sense of the direction of things. And I came back from interior retreat with renewed capacity to do what I had already decided, said Marcus. More equanimity to face the decision I had already made. Two legitimate forms of solitude, said Jesus. Two slightly different fruits. Marcus stood and walked slowly around the fountain. But there is also the danger of solitude, he said. Both of us, I think, risk something in our capacity for it. Jesus waited. The person who is capable of interior retreat, said Marcus, can be tempted to prefer it to the messy business of actual relationship. He paused. I was better in my head than in the room. The meditations are the thoughts of a man whose interior life was richer than his exterior relationships. I notice that Faustina appears rarely in them, said Jesus, referring to Marcus's wife. Marcus was quiet for a moment. She appears rarely, he said. Not because I did not love her. But because, he paused, the interior life and the relational life were not well integrated in me. A pause. I practiced communion with the Logos. I was less practiced at communion with the person across from me. And I had the opposite risk, said Jesus. My solitude was always in service of return. I withdrew in order to come back. He paused. The risk was the opposite, that solitude would always be instrumental, a tool for mission, and never simply rest. Being with the Father not to receive direction but to rest in the being with. Marcus looked at him. Did you manage that? To rest in the presence without it being about what you were going to do with it. Jesus was quiet. Sometimes, he said. In the best moments of prayer, yes. There was a quality of simply being present that was not about anything. He paused. But I also lived with urgency. There was much to do and little time. And urgency is the enemy of rest. For both of us, said Marcus. For both of us, agreed Jesus. The two sat with this for a moment. Two men of tremendous capacity for interiority, both of whom had lived lives that consumed their interior resources faster than they could be replenished. What is the right proportion? Asked Marcus. Between solitude and communion, between interior retreat and external engagement? I don't think it is a fixed proportion, said Jesus. I think it is a rhythm that the person must discover for themselves. He paused. What I know is that neither is sufficient without the other. The person who is all solitude becomes crystalline and disconnected. The person who is all communion becomes diffuse and loses the thread. The thread, said Marcus. The interior thread that runs through all the external noise. Yes, said Jesus. Solitude is where the thread is found and maintained. Communion is where it is expressed and tested. Marcus nodded. And when solitude and communion fail to integrate, when the interior thread is lost in the external noise, what then? Then you go back to the mountain, said Jesus. Or to the equivalent. The practice is not the experience, it is the return to the practice after losing it. Marcus looked at him. And if you cannot? If the circumstances do not allow it? Then you find the equivalent of interior retreat that your circumstances allow, said Jesus. A few minutes of silence in the middle of the day. The pause between decisions. He paused. The exterior silence of a mountain is useful but not required. The interior silence can be learned as a capacity that travels with you. Marcus nodded. That is what I attempted in the meditations, the capacity for inner retreat that did not depend on leaving the camp. And what I attempted in the midst of the crowds, said Jesus. Brief withdrawals of attention even while physically present. A pause. The disciples noticed when I was fully present to them and when I was present but with some part elsewhere. The elsewhere was not distraction. It was the maintenance of the thread. Marcus was quiet for a long time. What I recognize in what you describe, he said finally, is that solitude and communion are not opposites. They are two forms of the same thing, presence. Interior presence to oneself, or to the Logos, or to the Father. Exterior presence to the one in front of you. And the person who has learned the first, said Jesus, can finally offer the second fully. He paused. You cannot give presence you do not have. You can only give from the presence you have cultivated. Marcus looked at the fountain. The water, always new, always the same. I gave what I had, he said. It was not little, said Jesus. It was also not complete, said Marcus. Nothing is complete, said Jesus. Completion is not the measure. He paused. Faithfulness is the measure. Did you give what you had? Marcus was quiet. Then, yes. Then, said Jesus, that is enough. A silence followed, a different kind of silence. One that did not need filling. But Marcus, after a time, broke it. There is something I have not asked, he said. About your own integration of solitude and communion. He paused. The Last Supper. The night before your death. You could have spent that night alone, in prayer, in the mountains, in the preparation that your solitude always gave you. He paused. You chose to spend it at a table with 12 men, one of whom you knew would betray you. Jesus was quiet for a moment. Something in the memory visibly mattered. Yes, he said. Why? Because what I wanted to leave them, said Jesus, could not be left in words. Words can describe what bread is. Words can describe what wine is. He paused. But the gift I wanted to give required presence. Required sharing food. Required looking at each of them, Philip, who still didn't quite understand, Thomas, who would need to touch the wounds, Peter, who would deny me in a few hours, Judas, who had already decided, and still choosing to be with them. You knew Judas was there, said Marcus. And you served him anyway. I served him first, said Jesus. The washing of feet, that was the beginning of the evening. I washed Judas's feet. He paused. Because the love was not conditional on what he would do with it. That was the whole point. Marcus was quiet for a very long time. That is not something I could have done, he said. No, agreed Jesus. It requires a relationship with solitude that produces enough, what is the word, enough fullness, that you can give to someone who will take the gift and use it against you, without the giving destroying you. Solitude as the place where fullness is gathered, said Marcus. So that communion can extend even to the one who betrays. Yes, said Jesus. The most demanding form of communion. The extension of presence to someone who will refuse what you offer. He paused. Which is also what loving your enemies means in practice. Not loving an abstraction. Serving a specific person who intends you specific harm. Marcus considered this for a time. In the Meditations, he said, I wrote about people who wrong you. I wrote, they are wrong because they are ignorant. They cannot see clearly. He paused. My response to being wronged was philosophical distance. Understanding the cause. Reducing the anger through analysis. That protects you, said Jesus. It does not serve them. No, said Marcus. It does not. He paused. Your response to being wronged was to continue serving. Which required something I did not have. It required knowing that the fullness could not be depleted by what they took, said Jesus. That the source was not in me, but through me. He paused. When the source is inside you, the question is always, how much do I have left? When the source moves through you from something outside, the question becomes different. What question does it become? Asked Marcus. Whether you are open enough for the source to move through, said Jesus. Marcus was quiet with this for a long time. Then the integration of solitude and communion, he said at last, is not about managing your energy. It is about maintaining the opening through which something larger than you can flow. Through you, said Jesus. Not from you. Marcus nodded slowly. That changes everything about how you give, he said. And everything about what it costs. Reflexo. Reflection. Solitude and communion are not opposites, they are two poles of a single movement, the search for genuine presence. Solitude is where presence is cultivated, communion is where it is expressed and shared. Both Marcus Aurelius and Jesus knew the danger of each extreme, the person who retreats into interiority and loses the relational, and the person who gives themselves entirely to others and loses the thread of themselves. The rhythm that prevents both dangers is personal, no fixed formula works for everyone. But the principle is stable, you cannot give a quality of presence you have not cultivated. Interior life and relational life are not two separate projects. They are one project with two faces. Practice, this week, identify which direction you tend to drift, toward excessive solitude, withdrawing from difficult relationships under the guise of needing space, or excessive communion, filling every silence with activity or other people. Choose one concrete adjustment in the opposite direction. Not to eliminate your tendency, to expand your capacity. Chapter 11, Legacy and Eternity. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Matthew 6 verses 19-20. Alexander the Great and his mule driver both died and the same thing happened to both. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, 6.24. Marcus Aurelius thought about legacy constantly, and tried not to. It was one of the core tensions of his Stoic practice. The philosopher in him knew that concern with posthumous reputation was a preferred indifferent at best, something that had no bearing on the quality of a life and should not shape decisions. The human in him, the man who had governed an empire and written meditations that the deepest part of him hoped would survive, that man could not entirely dismiss the question of what he would leave behind. Alexander and his mule driver, he said, invoking the passage from the Meditations, died and the same thing happened to both. What empires they built, what distances they traveled, what wisdom they acquired, all resolved in the same dust. He paused. I wrote that to remind myself. But I did not entirely believe it. Jesus looked at him with the attention that cut past the philosophical formulation to what was underneath it. What did you believe instead? Asked Jesus. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That the things we do ripple forward in ways we cannot trace, he said. That a teacher who forms students who form other students creates something that outlasts the teacher by generations. That a just law, once established, serves people who never knew the man who wrote it. A pause. The Meditations were not intended to be published. But when I wrote them, there was something in them that was written, in a sense, for the future I would never see. Treasure in heaven, said Jesus. Marcus looked at him. You mean the text? I mean the impulse, said Jesus. What made you write them? He paused. You were laying something down that you believed mattered beyond your own time. That is closer to my teaching about treasure than it might seem. But your teaching is explicitly about not caring about earthly things, said Marcus. Not building here, but investing in what does not decay. The teaching is about the direction of your investment, said Jesus. Not the rejection of excellence. He paused. A man who writes honestly about how to live well, not for fame but because the truth is worth saying, that is investment in something that does not decay. And a man who writes to be admired, said Marcus. Writes for an audience that will die, said Jesus. And the desire for that audience's admiration will die with them. A pause. What the admired want is not the same as what the honest need. Marcus considered. There is a Stoic formulation, live as though you are going to die today, plan as though you will live for 100 years. That captures it, said Jesus. Live without attachment to earthly permanence. But build things worth building. He paused. The contradiction is only apparent. You can build a road knowing it will eventually crumble, and build it well because good work is worth doing regardless. Marcus nodded. The Meditations were built knowing they might not survive. One manuscript. I did not reproduce them. Did not ensure their preservation. He paused. And they survived. Why? Asked Jesus. Marcus was quiet. It was not a question he had examined carefully. Because they were honest, he said slowly. Because they showed a man struggling, not a hero succeeding. He paused. There is something in honesty that has more survival value than perfection. People can see through performance. They cannot see through real struggle. Because real struggle is recognizable, said Jesus. 2,000 years later, someone wakes at 3 a.m. and cannot sleep and picks up the Meditations and reads, when you wake with reluctance in the morning, let this thought be present, I rise to the work of a human being. He paused. That resonates not because it is impressive, but because it is true in a way that crosses time. Marcus looked at him. And your teaching survived differently. Through people, said Jesus. I wrote nothing. I chose to invest entirely in the formation of people who would carry what they had understood. Pause. That is both more fragile and more resilient than text. More fragile because people can misunderstand, said Marcus. More resilient because people adapt to new contexts in ways a text cannot. Yes, said Jesus. The tradition I left required constant reinterpretation. He paused. Some of that reinterpretation was good. Some of it was not. A longer pause. The distance between what I actually said and what was said in my name, over 2,000 years, is large enough to be painful. Marcus looked at him. You know what was done in your name? I know, said Jesus. The sentence was quiet in a way that carried much. They were silent for a moment. The Crusades, said Marcus. He knew the history by some means available in that place outside time. The Crusades, confirmed Jesus. And many other things. A pause. Which is why investing entirely in tradition, without the written text to check against, was a risk I knew I was taking. And you still made that choice, said Marcus. Because I believed that the Spirit, the presence I promised to send, would maintain a connection to the original over time. Not perfectly. But sufficiently. He paused. That is a different form of trust than writing a careful text. Marcus was quiet. Which is less controllable, he said. Much less, agreed Jesus. And more alive. Marcus nodded slowly. What is uncontrollable is also what is not dead. Yes, said Jesus. A text is fixed. It can be read correctly or incorrectly, but it does not change. A living tradition, made of people who carry something alive, can adapt, can correct itself, can breathe. He paused. At the cost of being less precise. And you accepted that cost. I accepted that cost, said Jesus. Because precision without life is useless. A perfectly preserved truth that cannot adapt to new contexts eventually speaks to no one. Marcus considered the Meditations, how they had been translated, interpreted, applied across cultures and centuries utterly different from Rome in the 2nd century. Some of the translations were certainly wrong in detail. Some of the applications were certainly off in emphasis. And still, they had done something in people's lives that the original Roman context could not have anticipated. Perhaps we both accepted the same cost, said Marcus. Just in different forms. You accepted imprecision of tradition. I accepted irrelevance of text. And both survived more than either of us expected, said Jesus. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he drew a parallel that had been forming since the conversation about the Crusades. What was done in the name of Stoicism, he said, was also not what I intended. He paused. Later Roman emperors used the model of the philosopher king, my model, to justify imperial expansion as civilizing mission. The conquest of peoples who did not ask to be conquered, conducted in the name of the rational order the Stoics described. He paused. I wrote, never esteem as advantageous to you what will make you break your word or lose your self-respect. A pause. That was used by men who broke every word and lost every scruple, who called what they did Stoic rationality. Jesus looked at him with the expression of someone who recognized what he was hearing. We are both in the same position, said Jesus. We left something genuine, said Marcus. Both of what we left was distorted by those who came after. He paused. Which suggests that the problem is not what we gave. It is what happens when what we give is separated from the living example that generated it. Yes, said Jesus. The teaching survives. The embodiment that gave it life is harder to transmit. He paused. You cannot easily weaponize a genuine encounter with conscience, with genuine Stoic self-examination. You can weaponize the vocabulary that follows, once the self-examination is forgotten. And a text, said Marcus, can be read without the context of struggle that made it necessary. He paused. Someone reads the Meditations and extracts principles of productivity. And misses entirely the man who was barely holding himself together, riding in a military tent, genuinely trying to become something he believed was worth becoming. The struggle matters as much as the conclusion, said Jesus. The struggle is the point, said Marcus. Not the answers I arrived at. The fact that I arrived at them in the middle of a life that gave me every reason to abandon the attempt. He paused. That is what is recognizable 2,000 years later. Not the philosophy. The reaching. Jesus looked at him steadily. And that, he said, is what cannot be weaponized. Someone who reads the Meditations with genuine attention encounters a man reaching, and is invited to reach in the same direction, for themselves. He paused. That quality of invitation is what endures. Not the specific formulations. The gesture of reaching honestly toward what is worth reaching for. Marcus was quiet for a time. Legacy as gesture, he said finally. Not as content. As direction. As living direction, said Jesus. Which is why the people who carry the most important things are not the ones who preserve the content most accurately, but the ones who have understood the direction and are moving in it themselves. Marcus looked at the fountain. The water, eternally new, eternally the same. A good image for tradition. What makes something worth leaving? Asked Marcus after a long pause. Jesus thought carefully before answering. Truth, he said. Or more precisely, the genuine contact with truth. Not the truth itself perfectly formulated, but the evidence that someone touched the real and was changed by it. A pause. Your meditations show a man in genuine contact with something real. My teaching, at its best, showed people in genuine contact with the love that underlies everything. Another pause. What lasts is not the perfection of the expression. It is the authenticity of the contact. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then legacy is not what you intend to leave, he said finally. It is what remained after you lived honestly. Yes, said Jesus. The preoccupation with legacy, with controlling what you leave behind, is precisely what tends to corrupt what you leave. He paused. Live honestly, build what is worth building, serve the people in front of you. What lasts will last. What doesn't was probably not built to. Marcus stood and walked to the edge of the fountain. He looked at his reflection in the water, that face that had governed an empire, written philosophy, endured years of war, and saw what it always was, a specific, finite face, caught in a moment, before the water moved. I do not know if I believed in eternity, said Marcus. But I do know I lived as though what we do here matters in ways we cannot fully see. That, said Jesus, is a very good way to live. He paused. And not as far from faith as you might think. Reflexo. Reflection. Legacy is one of the most seductive and most distorting preoccupations available to an ambitious person. The desire to leave something lasting can motivate extraordinary work, and can equally corrupt it, turning genuine service into performance, honest contribution into image management. Both Marcus and Jesus arrived at the same principle: what endures is not what you plan to leave, but what remains after you lived honestly. The meditations survived because they were private, written for the author himself, not for posterity. Jesus's teaching spread because it was lived before it was spoken. Practice: imagine that no one will ever know about a good thing you could do today, no record, no thanks, no legacy. Would you still do it? If yes, do it. If you hesitate, notice what that reveals about your motivation, and use it as information, not as self-condemnation. Chapter 12, Inner Peace. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled and do not be afraid. John 14 verse 27. If you separate from yourself, that is, from your thoughts about things, and from others' acts, and from everything you felt in the past, and from the future which fate brings, and exert yourself to live only the life that is now yours, what remains is very little time. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, 12.3. They had been speaking for what felt like a very long time. And yet neither of them was tired. Time was different in that place. Not absent, both of them were too rooted in the concrete to romanticize timelessness. But less pressured. As though the clock of the world had been suspended long enough for this conversation to complete itself. And now they were arriving, naturally, at the end of all the conversations: peace. The peace I sought, said Marcus, was ataraxia. Imperturbability. The state in which external events could not disturb the internal order. He paused. Not the absence of sensation. The sensation was still there, pain was felt, cold was cold, hunger was hunger. But none of it had the power to overthrow the governance of reason. And did you achieve it? Asked Jesus. Marcus considered carefully. In moments, he said. Flashes of clarity that lasted hours, sometimes days. A pause. But as a permanent state? He shook his head. No. There were nights when Commodus's betrayals dismantled my equanimity completely. When the plague killed people I had known and the rational framework for the moment could not absorb the weight of the grief. Grief dismantles philosophy, said Jesus, without judgment. It does, said Marcus. Which should tell us something about the limits of philosophy as a source of peace. Jesus nodded. The peace I described is different, he said. My peace I give you. Not as the world gives. He paused. The world's peace is the absence of conflict. It is circumstantial. When things are going well, there is peace. When they are not, there is not. What you offer is not circumstantial. It is a peace that can coexist with trouble, said Jesus. Do not let your hearts be troubled and do not be afraid. I said this the night before I died. A pause. That is not someone who has resolved the conflict. It is someone who has found something that the conflict cannot reach. Marcus considered. Something that coexists with the storm but is not of the storm. Yes, said Jesus. The image I used for the disciples was a vine and branches. The peace comes from the connection to the root, not from the conditions around the branches. When the connection is maintained, peace holds. When it is severed, by fear, by distraction, by the turning inward of ego, the storm gets in. And what maintains the connection? Asked Marcus. Love, said Jesus. Which we have already discussed. But here it takes a specific form, trust. He paused. The peace I describe requires trusting that the Father has not lost the thread of things. That the chaos is not final. That the story is not over at the worst point. Marcus was quiet. That requires a specific theological conviction. It requires a specific trust, said Jesus. Which is not identical to a theological conviction, though it tends to produce one. He paused. You can trust before you can formulate what you are trusting. And Stoic peace, said Marcus, does not require trust in a personal God. It requires alignment with the Logos. Which is another form of trust, said Jesus. Trust that the rational structure of reality is ultimately oriented toward the good. A pause. The difference is that Stoic trust is in an impersonal principle. My peace is in a personal love. He paused. And personal love is warmer, but also harder to hold on to. Because you can doubt a person in a way you cannot doubt a principle. Marcus looked at him. You doubted on the cross. Completely, said Jesus. My God, why have you forsaken me is not the cry of someone whose peace is intact. He paused. But it was also addressed to someone. Not uttered into the void. A pause. Even the doubt was relational. Marcus was quiet with that observation for some time. The idea that even complete darkness could be addressed, that the breaking of peace could itself be an act of relationship, was something that resisted easy analysis. The deepest peace, then, said Marcus slowly, is not the absence of disturbance. It is the presence of a relationship that can hold the disturbance. Something like that, said Jesus. Not perfectly. But in the direction of truth. Marcus stood and walked to the edge of the square. The horizon was still and bright. No wind moved the olive trees at the boundary of the space. I found peace in the meditations, he said. Not permanent peace. Not imperturbable peace. But a return path. A practice that, when followed, led back toward the still center more reliably than anything else I found. The practice is real, said Jesus. The tool is genuine. He paused. What I am saying is that there is a peace accessible beyond the limits of that tool. Not instead of it. Beyond it. Available to the philosopher? Asked Marcus. Available to anyone, said Jesus. Which is why I said not as the world gives. The world gives peace as achievement, as the product of effort, status, philosophical training. He paused. What I give is available without achievement. Which is the thing achievement-oriented people find hardest to receive. Marcus turned to look at him. Including me. Including you, said Jesus. Though you came closer than most. Marcus returned to his stone. He sat with a deliberateness that had something in it of a decision. When I was on the Danube, he said, and the plague was at its worst, and I had done everything a philosopher could do and the suffering continued, I found, sometimes, a quiet that was not produced by my own effort. He paused. I wrote it off as exhaustion. Thought, the mind finally stops fighting because it has no more energy to fight with. What if it was not exhaustion? Said Jesus. Marcus looked at him. What if it was grace, said Jesus, meeting the philosopher in the place where philosophy had brought him as far as it could, and then carrying him beyond. Marcus was quiet for a long time. If that is true, he said finally, then the path I walked was not sufficient by itself. But it was the right path to walk. The path that brought you to the threshold, said Jesus. Yes. And at the threshold, said Marcus. Something was waiting, said Jesus. Marcus looked at the fountain. The water murmured unchanged, as it had from the beginning of their conversation and as it would long after. A peace that did not depend on whether anyone was listening. I am not sure I can say I believe, said Marcus. But I am no longer sure I disbelieve. He paused. Perhaps that is the most honest place I can reach. For now, said Jesus. Yes. Is it enough? Jesus looked at him with that expression that was not pity and not condescension and was something harder to name, something closer to what a father looks like when a child takes a first step. For now, he said, it is exactly enough. Marcus sat with this for a time. The fountain continued its quiet speech. The fig tree held its shade. Then he asked the question he had been carrying the longest. Not the philosophical question, those had been asked and given their answers. This was the personal question that all the philosophical questions had been circling. How do I know, he said, whether the peace I find in the Meditations is philosophical achievement or grace? Jesus looked at him carefully. Why does the distinction matter to you? Because, said Marcus, if it is philosophical achievement, then it is something I did. Something within my power to produce. Something I can teach clearly to others by describing the method. He paused. But if it is grace, if it is something given, then I have been misrepresenting it every time I wrote. I have been claiming credit for something that was not mine to claim. Ah, said Jesus. And something in the sound of that single syllable suggested that this was the question he had been waiting for. What do you see in the writing, said Marcus, that tells you which it is? Jesus was quiet for a moment. There is a passage you wrote, he said, in Book V. You wrote, at dawn, when you rise reluctantly, let this thought be present, I rise to the work of a human being. He paused. Then you continued, and if I do what I was made for, what follows comes by nature. He paused. 2 sentences. The first is effort. An act of will to do what the body resists. He looked at Marcus. The second is reception. What follows comes by nature. Not what I produce by my nature. What comes? Marcus was very still. You are saying, he said slowly, that even in my own writing, I distinguished between what I did and what arrived. I am saying that you noticed the distinction, said Jesus. You named it. You described both sides. He paused. The effort and the arrival. The reaching and the meeting. A pause. A man who only believes in philosophical achievement does not write what follows comes by nature. He writes what I produce by discipline. A pause. The word comes is a word of reception, not production. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Something settled in him, quietly, without announcement. Then I was describing grace, he said. Without the word. You were describing the structure of your actual experience, said Jesus. Which was both. The effort and the given. The reaching and the met. He paused. That is not a contradiction. It is the shape of how these things actually work. A pause. You reach because something is already calling. You find because something is already present. The effort is real. The grace is also real. They are not competing descriptions of the same event. They are both accurate descriptions of different aspects of what actually happened. Marcus considered this with the full weight of someone who has been careful with words for 40 years. Then the question is not which is it? He said finally. The question is, how do I hold both without collapsing one into the other? By practicing both, said Jesus. The discipline that develops the capacity to receive. And the openness that receives what the discipline alone cannot produce. He paused. Marcus, you already knew this. You practiced it for decades. What you lacked was a name for the second half. Marcus was quiet for a time that was the kind of quiet that follows a long answer to a long question. And the name, he said finally. Grace, said Jesus. Or gift. Or simply, what comes by nature. He paused. You already chose your own word. I am only telling you it was the right one. Reflexo. Reflection. The peace that Marcus describes, ataraxia, imperturbability, is the product of philosophical discipline. Real. Achievable. Enormously valuable. The peace Jesus describes is something else, a peace that coexists with trouble, that is maintained through relationship rather than achievement, that is available not only at the summit of philosophical effort but at the threshold where effort has brought you as far as it can and something else must carry you the rest of the way. Both are available. They are not the same. And perhaps the most honest position for a serious person, philosopher or practitioner of faith, is exactly where Marcus arrived, no longer certain in the denial, genuinely open to the possibility. Practice, sit in complete silence for 10 minutes. Do not try to achieve peace. Do not apply a technique. Simply be present with whatever is. At the end, ask yourself, was there anything present that my effort did not produce? Take that question seriously. Conclusion, what remained? The square was unchanged. The fountain still murmured. The fig tree extended its shade unhurried. The sky, if that was what it was, held the same still brightness it had held from the beginning. What was different was something harder to name. The quality of the silence. As though a conversation had taken place there that could not be taken back. Marcus Aurelius stood. He looked at Jesus for a long time without speaking, not with the analytical gaze he had spent the conversation training on ideas, but with something quieter and more direct. You are not what I expected, he said. Jesus tilted his head slightly. What did you expect? Marcus thought honestly. A mystic. Someone who spoke in parables that evaded analysis. Someone who offered comfort without rigor. He paused. What I found was a philosopher with better premises than I started with. Not better, said Jesus. Complementary. He paused. Your rigor is something I do not have in the same form. The meditations are the most systematically honest self-examination I have encountered. Marcus considered. And your love is something I had but did not fully recognize. Perhaps, said Jesus. Or perhaps something you were moving toward that you never fully arrived at. Not everything arrived at while alive, said Marcus. Some things arrive after. Jesus nodded. Yes. They were quiet for a moment. What do I do with this conversation? Asked Marcus. Jesus looked at him. What you always did with the important ones, carry it. Let it change what it needs to change. Let it confirm what needs confirming. He paused. Do not try to resolve it into a system. That is against my nature. I know, said Jesus. Which is why I am suggesting it explicitly. Marcus allowed something close to a smile. Fair. He sat down again, just for a moment, in the way someone sits when they want to hold a place a little longer before leaving. There is one question I did not ask, he said. Ask it. Do you think the Stoic path leads somewhere? Said Marcus. In the end. After everything. He paused. Or is it a road that stops short of what matters most? Jesus was quiet for a moment. Not to manufacture the pause, but because the question deserved its weight. The path you walked, he said finally, is a path of genuine seeking. Of honest alignment with what is real, as best as you could understand it, with the tools you had. He paused. I believe that every genuine step toward the good, the true, and the beautiful is a step toward the source of goodness, truth, and beauty. Whatever name you give that source. A longer pause. Your path does not stop short. It arrives at a threshold. What is beyond the threshold requires something other than philosophy to enter. But philosophy is what can bring you there. Marcus held that carefully. Then I did not waste my life. You did not waste your life, said Jesus. Simply and completely. Marcus stood. The conversation was over, not because the questions were resolved, but because the right questions were now in the right place, and that was what the conversation was for. He looked at Jesus one more time. The peace you offer, he said. Is it available to the Stoic? It is available to anyone willing to receive what they cannot achieve, said Jesus. Including Stoics. He paused. Perhaps especially Stoics. Marcus nodded once, with the kind of nod that is a real acknowledgement. He walked to the edge of the square. At the boundary he stopped and turned. There is something I want to say, said Marcus. That I did not expect to say. Jesus waited. I came here as a Stoic, said Marcus. I leave as a Stoic who has encountered something that the tradition has not accounted for. Not as a convert. Not as someone who has abandoned what was true. He paused. But as someone who now suspects that the logos, at its deepest level, is not impersonal. Jesus was quiet for a moment. Then, that is more than enough. Is it a beginning? Asked Marcus. It is exactly a beginning, said Jesus. Which is all a beginning can be. Marcus looked at the fountain one more time. The water moving, always new, returning nothing to where it had been. Dum spiro, spiro, he said. While I breathe, I hope. Jesus looked at him. That is not Stoic. No, agreed Marcus. Perhaps I learned something. He crossed the threshold and was gone. Jesus remained at the fountain. He looked at the water for some time. The conversation had been real. The questions were real. The distance between two ways of understanding the world was real, and smaller than it appeared, and larger than it felt. What remained was what always remained, the next person, and the question they carried, and the willingness to sit and listen until the question became the answer. The fig tree extended its shade. The fountain murmured. And the square waited, unhurried, for whoever came next. For Marcus Aurelius, who sought the good in reason, and found, perhaps, something that reason was pointing toward. For Jesus, whose peace surpasses understanding and yet, somehow, can be understood. And for the reader who carries questions in both hands and has not yet decided which one to put down. A final note. The dialogue in this book is invented. Marcus Aurelius and Jesus never met. But the ideas they represent are real, documented, and in conversation across 2,000 years of human thought. Every argument I placed in Marcus's mouth has a root in the Meditations, in Epictetus, in Marcus Aurelius's letters and the Stoic philosophical tradition. Every response I gave to Jesus has a root in the Gospels, in Paul's letters, in the Christian theological tradition. What I invented was the form, the setting, the direct exchange, the specific sentences. What I did not invent was the substance. I tried only to bring it into conversation, to let each tradition speak clearly enough that the other could genuinely respond. What the two traditions share, the seriousness of ethics, the primacy of inner life over external circumstance, the centrality of practice over theory, the conviction that how you live matters more than what you say about how you live. Where they diverge, Stoicism grounds virtue in reason and self-sufficiency, Christianity grounds it in love and grace. Stoic peace is achieved, Christian peace is received. The Logos is impersonal, the Father is personal. The goal is ataraxia, the promise is joy. These divergences are real. They are not resolved in this book, because I do not believe they should be resolved by making one of them disappear. The tension is productive. The conversation is ongoing. If this book sends you back to the Meditations with new questions, it has done part of its work. If it sends you back to the Gospels with a more philosophical eye, it has done the rest. What you do with the questions, that is yours. Paulo Soler.